Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is a special meeting of the Land Use Citizens Task Force of the Lake Rock Park District. It is April 5th, 2022, and we are all, or most of us, gathered in person for the first time in the history of this task force, and we're all a little wondering about how this is going to work. So we've got most of the task force here. We have staff here. If we have audience members who would like to come in and visit with us live, that would be great. We have folks on Zoom, including a couple of presenters, and we have two of our task force members participating via Zoom as well. Thank you all for coming. I'll call the meeting to order, and Jim, if you could call the roll, please.
Yes. So Chair Kraus?
Here.
Committee Member Truss?
Here.
Committee Member Dewar?
Here.
Committee Member Douglas?
Here via Zoom.
Committee Member Gottschalk?
Here.
Committee Member Russell?
Here.
And Committee Member Stoll?
Here on Zoom.
We have.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And Commissioner Park Board Liaison.
Yes.
We have a quorum physically present here in the meeting room, so we have an official meeting. Nikki, is there anything that you would like to discuss with the task force from prior meeting? We have a very nice summary of the issues that we discussed, and I know we had at least two members with comments that you've incorporated. Any additional thoughts for us?
I would like to thank the two task force members who contributed to the notes. That was Al and George. I've incorporated most of those suggested changes. There's one point that I included in the notes that I would like to get a little bit more background on, and that comes up in the, well, it doesn't really come up in the minutes. Anyway, it was when Mr. Ryan, who was our speaker, mentioned that there would be a need to take down trees between the fairways. I'm not sure what that was based on, because I would have thought that it would be contingent upon whatever design we ended up choosing. So I put it in the notes pretty much as he stated it, but I'm just not sure that that's a given. These key points are supposed to be things that we've all agreed upon, and I'm not sure that point quite makes the cut. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate hearing it.
George, do you have any? I have a thought, but
I think the way that you stated it, Nikki, is appropriate. I don't think Mr. Ryan indicated that 100% of the trees would have to come down, but I think logically, due to the extent of some of the excavation, that there will be a lot of tree loss. That will need to be determined once there is a design and then construction. But I don't know if we can refine it any further.
Well, I think it also depends on the kind of tree. There are upland trees, there are wetland trees, and there are swamp trees. So if you've got an area that's going to become a wetland and you've got an upland tree, that tree probably can't live with its feet wet. And so it will probably have to come down. On the other hand, if it be something like a swamp white oak or a bald cypress, it can stay. So it really depends on the kind of tree it is and exactly where it's placed in relationship to the wetlands.
Yes, the words he used were between the fairways, and I'm afraid I don't know enough about golf to know where the fairways might be. But I think maybe it would be best to just modify the wording in my notes slightly by saying some tree removal may be necessary, which may raise concerns from residents. And I feel like that just leaves it an open question.
I think we're all okay with that.
Yeah.
I think we need more information about and it is part of the design phase. Mark, you can do
Yeah, I think that Member Treff's comments Mr. Ryan was rather specific in his comments at the last meeting, and it did have to do with the environmental match of trees with particularly with moisture. And I think that if we left it in and left it open, I think it leaves the door open a bit for someone to infer that this is kind of some sort of a widespread process without purpose. And I think, for example, you can start here at the corner at 176 and go west along 176 and see a variety of situations where Lobola has planted different trees for different moisture circumstances. And that's a good example of those kinds of situations where you would do that. And I think what he was suggesting was that, Mr. Ryan was also suggesting was that we may not choose to leave the existing trees there if they're going to die. And that's I think I'd feel more comfortable adding the facts, the additional facts that were given to us last week, than to leave that as open. Again, I guess I'm repeating myself, lest someone think that there was some indeterminate reason that we might sacrifice a tree.
If everybody's okay with that, I suggest that Mark get with Nikki and just add that sentence or two.
Yeah.
Because that is what he said. And
That's what he said.
That's fine with me. Everybody okay?
No, Mr. Ryan is on the call.
Sure. John?
Hello, everybody.
Hi, John.
The reason I brought up the trees is not only from the aspect of a wetland mitigation bank, but also from the aspect of being a earth mover for several decades. If you are going to provide that much flood storage, there's a massive amount of grading, and I don't see conceptually at this point how you would save those trees. And so obviously there's no plan yet, but just trying to be realistic that I don't, from my experience, both in wetlands and in earth moving, I really don't see those rows of trees being able to remain. So I brought that up because I know it's a sensitive topic, but I thought it's something that you should be aware of early on.
Okay. Thank you.
Something to do with that too.
Yeah. Thanks. I think, Mark, if you could work with
I'll
Nikki.
touch base with Nick.
And then why don't we make a note that we show this again next time, so that we can just get one more look at it. Thank you, everybody. Agenda item number 1D, statement of visitors. The task force, as well as all of the Park District meetings, allows a certain portion of time at the beginning of each meeting for members of the audience, and I can now say either in person or via Zoom, that would like to address the task force on areas within our responsibility and generally not within our agenda items tonight. But we will listen to any comments people have. We ask for 3 minutes maximum. Are there any individuals here present? Thank you. If you could just go over here so you're in a, thank you. This is exciting, a live meeting with a live audience. It's, yeah, and just the microphone will, they'll tell you over there. The man behind the desk will tell you.
Okay.
If you need to speak.
So exciting. Hi, my name is Mary Scanlon Hogan, and I am reading this statement on behalf of Rich Martin, who is also a resident of Lake Bluff. Thank you for all the hard work and time the task force has put into this important issue. Your professionalism and attention to detail has been outstanding. Let me take this opportunity to preface my comments to mention that I am not anti-golf in any way. I come from a family of golfers and have lots of friends that love the game. It's a game that provides an opportunity to enjoy the outdoors and get in some light exercise. I realize that the Park District is a nonprofit entity that does not look to make a profit on services it provides to the people of Lake Bluff. However, the Lake Bluff Golf Club has been hemorrhaging millions of dollars for the past 20 years to the detriment of other Park District programs and opportunities. It has lost nearly $2 million since 2015 and is projected to lose another 1.1 million in the next 6 years, according to your presentation on March 8th, 2022. Given this, I was surprised that the finances of the golf club were being characterized as stabilized and or getting close to break even. In 2020 and 2021, the Lake Bluff Golf Club experienced banner years in terms of rounds of golf played and gross revenues, but the golf club still lost over $430,000 during those 2 years. It is important to note that since Golf Visions has taken over operations of the golf club, the finances have improved, but are still unsustainable. Golf Visions has offered to pay for more future capital expenses, but nothing has been finalized or agreed upon. However, the timing of this offer has coincided with SMC's proposal, so it's important to keep that in mind if the Park District decides to extend their lease. If the Park Board decides to reject the SMC proposal and its potential windfall of roughly $10 million, will Golf Visions be as generous in the future without the SMC proposal hanging over their head? At the end of the potential lease extension, which is the end of 2028, there will almost certainly be a new batch of big capital expenses to contend for the golf club. Aging golf courses like the Lake Bluff Golf Club are historically capital intensive. Who will be on the hook for those big cap losses? Thank you again for your careful and time-consuming work on this project. Respectfully, Rich Martin.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you also to Rich. We will be addressing this topic later on today in our meeting today with some revised numbers. So hopefully, if there still are questions after we have that presentation, we'd be happy to address them at that point.
We do have one comment on Zoom. Todd Porter.
Great. Hello, Todd.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I echo Rich's comment that you guys are doing great work. I want to just comment a little bit on the page 43 of you today. I think it's important data to me, and important data to be accurate about, and I'm afraid as I look at it, rather than being factual, it looks like highly uncertain estimates. But to be more specific, if you look at that data on page 43, the key issue is on the top line is the resident versus non-resident usage of the rounds on the on day of sale. And this data is pretty strong, as that in 2019, the usage went from 26% up to 41% in 2020, and then still very significantly higher, 33% in 2021. And it's even more striking if you realize that in 2018, when once again we were discussing the golf course, the Park District's data indicated that 20% of the rounds were from residents. And so it's a very striking, dramatic increase in resident the golf course. And so I think it's important that we be very accurate about that. And the first question you have to think about is, how plausible is it that while golf usage by non-residents increased 50% over this time period, for Lake Bluff residents, it increased 100%. So not only did we're saying golf, usage dramatically increased, but Lake Bluff, relative to all the other communities, Lake Forest and Libertyville, we dramatically exceeded all these other communities in our involved and increased use of golf. And that question becomes even more difficult to assess when you look at the footnotes to this table, and I don't know if you have it in front of you, but if you read footnote 3, it says Gulf Visions does not provide data on the percentage of Park District residents who use. Seems on its face to be a fairly strong indictment of that data that's presented that purports to say what the resident usage is, because Gulf Visions is the entity collecting that data. And perhaps what they are saying is that they can, on day of sale, determine the difference between residents and non-residents, and that seems to be what they're indicating. But I don't know if any of you have golfed there recently, but I certainly haven't. My daughter has. I'd like to golf with my foursome, and here's my $250, and they say great. And what zip code do you reside at? And you say your zip code and go on your way. And they don't verify any of that information, and they certainly don't verify it for every member in a foursome. And the reason they don't, they have no incentive.
We understand, and we're going to get to that. I mean, that is an item on tonight's agenda. And I would really like to defer the discussion to where it is on the agenda. You're raising very good questions. I was directly involved, as were most of the task force members, in those numbers. And for any member of the audience or anyone who's looking at the video of this, there was a new distribution of this packet today, this morning, around 9 o'clock. And the only addition was the chart that Todd is talking about. It's the last page in this packet. And if Todd, if you don't mind, I'd like to defer the rest of this conversation to when we get to it on the agenda. We will talk about.
I don't mind at all.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, anyone else?
That's everyone.
Okay. All right, great. Let's go to the minutes. The minutes of our meeting of March 22nd, 2022 was distributed with our packet on Friday. Are there any corrections, changes, or additions?
I have two very quick comments. Number one, I think it would be good policy when we first prepare minutes that we always add the word draft to the minutes until they are approved, right in the title. Person that once they incorporate the approved changes, that the word draft just gets deleted. It's just very good for record keeping purposes, particularly since corrections offered, sometimes they're important points that a member thinks should be made.
So Jim,
I hope that can be done.
take a note of that. And George, I apologize. You had asked me to do that 2 months ago, and I guess I didn't do it. I'm sorry.
I don't know why I don't think you're preparing the minutes, but anyway.
Well, you asked me to make that.
No need to apologize. And then the other item is on page 11, this one word change. It was page 11 of the packet.
Yep.
The very first paragraph at the top, the third sentence, he being Mr. Ryan commented that it would be detrimental to have the bank not functioning, and that should be in the context of that paragraph. He was talking about it would be detrimental to not have the golf course functioning right up until construction was authorized.
Right. So change bank to golf.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Any other corrections, changes, additions? Anything from
I have no changes, but I have a request, and this is sort of consequent to George's comment. Once the final version of the minutes has been prepared that incorporates the changes that come up in our meetings, could we please get a copy of that for our records?
Sure.
Thanks.
And that could be done even a couple days after the meeting. Okay, good. Any other comments, changes, corrections? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to approve as amended. So have a second?
Second.
A motion by Mark, second by Julie, to approve the minutes of our meeting of March 22, 2022 as amended. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any? Motion passes. Okay, on to our reports and discussions. Our first issue is let me back up. We've been meeting now, how many meetings have we had? 7? And all of our meetings have been in the information gathering mode. We have listened to a variety of speakers on a variety of topics, gathering information, learning as we go along, hopefully helping community members learn as well. This meeting is the last in that series, and our primary discussion today is around the regulatory framework for building mitigation banks and how the park district, if they decide to go that route, what would need to be done based on each of the regulatory structures. I'm going to turn this portion of the meeting over to Julie, whose firm, Catton, I used to call him Catton Mutual, but I guess you're just now Catton, just like my firm truncated itself a few years ago, who graciously gave their time and expertise to help our initiative. That your expertise is greatly appreciated, and we welcome the individuals that you're going to be introducing.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Steve. Yes, when Steve first came to me and asked if I would take charge of overviewing the various regulatory schemes, I knew that this was not a project for me personally. I have no expertise in this area. So I did what any good lawyer does, and I called someone who I know does have expertise. So I would like to introduce first my partner, Nancy Rich. She's an environmental lawyer at my firm. We've worked together for many, many decades, and she very graciously agreed to jump in. And then Nancy and I looked at each other and we did what any good partners do, which is to say, let's find someone who will do the really heavy lift and all the hard work. And so we recruited Juan Mata, who is a relatively new associate at the firm, and he very enthusiastically signed on to dig into the weeds on the regulatory schemes. He's put together not only the handout, very detailed handout, and did a fantastic job on that, but has also now put together a PowerPoint. So he's going to walk us through the PowerPoint tonight that'll go through and talk about the different regulatory schemes. Nancy will chime in as needed. She's a great resource. She has experience with mitigation banks and wetlands. If we have questions, we can put them to her. And at the end, she can share some additional observations with us. One caveat I do want to make clear is this is not legal advice. This is simply guidance. Where we have not been retained to give legal advice to the task force of the park district, so this is not that. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Juan. Thanks again, both of you.
And Juan, before you start, I assume it's okay if we have questions or we want a comment elaborated, we should just squirt it out right away, just do it interactively?
You're muted, Juan, yeah.
However you guys prefer and however you guys normally run things will work. So feel free to shout whenever you want clarification or have a follow-up question.
And I have a favor I'm going to ask Noah. I'm going to try to pull this up so that I can see this. Is there any way you can move the screen?
Not the cameras.
No, but move the screen forward anyway, so that we might better see the presentation. If that's a limitation, I get it.
I can move it about 3 more inches and then it starts to block the camera.
Gotcha. That's fine. That's fine. I'm gonna guess if you can't see it, you're okay. Great.
Okay,
Thank you so
let's
much.
pull up the, Jeff, I'm not sure how you're going to do the screen sharing, but I'll let you guys figure that out so we can get the presentation on our screen and the screen for our vast viewing audience.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share the screen on my end, and I think that might translate to what you guys are aiming for, but let me know if I should hold off on starting until Noah figures out whatever needs to be figured out on that end.
Yeah, let's get it on the screen.
Can everybody see that?
Yes. And if you could just maximize it on your screen.
Yes. Everybody see that?
Yes, we will make this available.
So, Jeff and Juan, what we're seeing right now is a typical PowerPoint presentation screen that has 2/3 of the screen with the presentation. On the left side is the preview with looks like text. So if somehow you could maximize that so we only see the slides. And then Noah or Jeff, we don't need to see the people over on the right side. If we could, there we go. Okay, any way to make that bigger? If not, let's just go ahead.
I did go ahead and maximize it. It's maximized on my screen, so I'm not quite sure what the technical difficulty there is.
Do you have it in view mode 1?
I do.
Hmm.
Give me 1 second. I think I can figure out a quick way. If not, then we'll just present it as it appears, if that's all right.
Sure. And this is the first time we're using this technology, so.
It's a little smoother when we're all in our own.
Well, it's hard too. You know, our audience sees us as this.
There we
Oh,
go.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have to do film check. All right, Juan, let's go. Looking forward to this.
That sounds great. Thank you for the introduction, Julie, and I'm glad we figured out this Zoom in business, one step at a time. Just to reassess, this presentation is clearly a source of information only, and it's not legal advice. We have not been retained as counsel. So with some intro remarks, we'll just jump right into it. Just to be clear at the outset, the goal of this presentation is to provide a comparison of 2 distinct regulatory paths, the one for the Stormwater Management Commission and the one for the Corps of Engineers Interagency Coordination Agreement. There will be certain aspects of both plans that are specific to those plans, and they do not overlap. They are distinct paths. For example, there's a permit required under one plan that is not required under the other plan, and they cannot be substituted for each other regardless of the path you take. So with that in mind, we do also want to go ahead and advise that because of the technical nature of the exact requirements broken down, both scientific or otherwise, it would be best if the task force consults with the wetland consultant just to determine what program best fits everybody's objectives.
Juan, could you, before we jump off here, can you remind us who the members of the IRC are?
I'm so sorry, there was some feedback. Would you mind repeating yourself?
Yeah, who are the IRT members? It's like Illinois or US EPA,
Fish and Wildlife.
Fish and Wildlife.
The IRT members of the interagency review team. So they're essentially a team created by this agreement that reviews it in conjunction with the Corps in the Chicago district.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. So there will be several areas that we'll be comparing today. This is also in the paper format of this presentation. You will see the same exact categorization. This is just an overview, so we're going to be going over each of these points throughout the presentation. We're going to go ahead and start off with a bit of an overview of each plan in the initial stages. Starting with the SMC plan, so the Stormwater Management Commission plan. They have been focused on preferring wetland creation, which is, if I assume correctly, it's what the golf course is going to end up becoming, a creation of wetlands rather than a rehabilitation. So under this plan, they do require a preliminary pre-application informational meeting with the SMC. In that meeting, they'll provide further guidance and regulatory and legal considerations that you'll take into account and put in your initial request. Yes, go ahead, Nikki.
I don't think it's accurate to say that the Stormwater Management Commission per se prefers wetland creation. Do you mean that their approach does, or that the commission in this particular case is encouraging wetland creation?
Yes, so the ordinance and the commission is encouraging wetland creation in comparison to, say, rehabilitation of existing wetlands.
So their process is geared towards wetland creation, is that correct?
It's a preference. When they're analyzing the prospectus and the initial application, it's a consideration they take into account. The weight that it has on the actual process is unclear strictly by the ordinance, and it's something that they could better inform you on that informational meeting with them. But it is a stated preference, and it just is a marker to keep in the back of everyone's head as to perhaps who would be more willing and to approve the final design or plan. That's the only reason why it's included in there, but it is a consideration, yes.
Okay, thanks very much.
Absolutely. So after that pre-informational meeting, you'll submit an initial request, which will include a watershed development permit application and a bank prospectus. We'll get into what exactly is required in that bank prospectus a little later, but that's just an initial starting point. Once you submit that initial request, the MSC then issues a public notice period, which essentially just consists of a 30-day comment period and where they publish the initial request application and the prospectus, and they let the public comment on their ideas and their thoughts about it. With that period, at the end of that period, then SMC and the bank sponsor, so us, would create an authorizing document together. And that authorizing document is based on that initial prospectus that you created, which you'll see later on is fairly detailed. After we create that authorizing document with the SMC, then the SMC will perform a site inspection and they'll issue a written response, which will identify if the bank is likely to survive or if they agree with the design and that it will meet the goal of the ordinance. And if it's positive, it normally means that they agree and it's very likely to receive a permit, a watershed development permit and approval of the bank. But once you do have that written approval, that written response, then you submit the formal request, which will include the permit application again, a copy of the prospectus, and a detailed plan, which we'll also tackle in a little bit, as well as securing adequate financial assurances, which will also be a topic we'll cover a little bit later on. And just to have the immediate comparison to the corpse approach, instead of requiring a pre-informational meeting, they only strongly recommend it. And they also strongly recommend a site visit. Again, this is because of the difference in preference. The corpse approach does prefer the reestablishment of former wetlands, so that's reflected in their encouragement of a site visit early on to see the potential. But after that pre-application or site visit, or if there's a choice to not do it, you would submit a prospectus and a Department of Army permit. And then a similar public notice period as in the SMC approach will occur, and it'll be a minimum 30-day comment period. And after that period and the approved prospectus, then the applicant, go ahead.
Nope, I don't think anyone said anything.
Oh, okay, then it might have just been feedback. Right, so after that initial comment period and the approved prospectus, then the applicant drafts the banking instrument in comparison to the SMC plan where the SMC and the applicant together draft the banking instrument. This one is just by the applicant, so the onus is a little bit more on the applicant than in the SMC approach. And you should also include a description of the plan application of the financial assurances as well in that draft. After that, the interagency review team would decide on the viability of the proposed banking instrument, and if it's positive, the permit will ensue and work can start. And that's just a bit of the overview. If there are any questions on that, feel free. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and dive into more specific areas.
So I do have a question.
Sure.
And this is one for you and also for Nancy. It appears, and this dovetails with our independent reading, that the Corps of Engineers proposal is not just one more step in the application process, but a more cumbersome process than the Stormwater Management Commission process. Do you have any guidance for us as to how long it typically takes an applicant to go from the submission of the first level plans to the from the dark blue on the upper left to the light blue over on the bottom right? Any guidance for us on how long that whole process might take?
So the only time that they include in the ordinance is that minimum 30-day comment period. They do not include any time minimums or maximums for, if Nancy might have a better idea through experience, but there's nothing in the ordinance directly to give a proper timeline on that.
Yeah, that's correct, Juan. In my experience, and I do more work in DuPage and other counties than I have lately in Lake, but in my experience, it really depends on all of these other factors in terms of your consultants and so much on the quality of the wetlands and the scope of your plan. So it's really very site specific and project specific in that way.
Okay. Thank you.
So
Absolutely.
there's a lot of internal review, shall we say, and back and forth until the court or the IRT are satisfied.
There can be, and I'll tell you, that's why it's so important to have a consultant that you really work well with and trust. And I know that John Ryan has spoken, and obviously he has a fantastic reputation. And I'm not encouraging you to hire anybody over anybody else, but the good news here is that you have a good choice in our area. I think you've heard from some other folks as well. And that's it. I would suggest that you just keep interviewing people and talking to them and have them help you see from the technical perspective what program seems best for you and how they perceive timing.
Okay, let's continue, please.
Thing. So the first thing we're going to tackle, and I think is what's important to the task force initially, is the credit schedule, how you establish the credits and the certification of credits, and then the sale of those credits under each plan, because that is a goal of the task force, is to achieve those credits. So right here, I've included a chart that explains the differences in the release schedule of credits. You also have a similar chart in the PDF, I believe on page 19, and then in bullet point form on page 31 and 32. So feel free to look at those while I go ahead and cover these. So there are initial 4 phases for a release schedule of credits under both plans. The initial release of credits is kind of similar under both plans. Under the SMC, you can get a max of 30% of total potential credits for your plan credited after the approval of the bank charter. So no construction has to have been started, no actual progress in that sense needs to have been started, but you get 30% right off the bat after the signing of that bank charter. And under the corpse approach, you get a little lesser percentage, it's a max of 20%, and it does require that the equated banking instrument is signed, the financial assurance is secured, and the site protection instrument is recorded. And that's just the initial release of credits. That's 30% on one side and 20% on the other. And then on the second release of credits, it does require you to be past the construction stage, and it has metrics that you need to have been meeting in order to be able to get these remaining credits. On the second release of credits, under the SMC plan, you get an additional 20% on top of the 30% you already have gotten. And that is after you demonstrate the wetland hydrology and planning is at the point that you agreed to for it to be and designed for it to be. And under the corpse plan, you do get an additional 25% of credits rather than the additional 20%. And that's after hydrology is demonstrated and the performance standards are met for at least 2 consecutive growing seasons. And the 2 consecutive growing seasons is a bit of a time gap for those credits, but that's to be expected under both plans. And I will say that under both plans, these are negotiable in some sense with the SMC and the corpse, but that's something that you pursue with them with your particular design and through the wetland consultant. And there's a third release of credits, of course, and the third release of credits happens after the completion of the approved planting plan. So the vegetation that you agreed to, those benchmarks, if they've been met or if they haven't been met, those credits will be released accordingly. That's a 20% increase under the SMC plan. And the corpse side of it is a bit more ambiguous in that they do agree to release more credits, but that percentage will vary based on whatever agreement they approve that you've submitted to them. So it does allow for some flexibility, but it could go in either direction. It is still based on the vegetation performance standard, and that one is also negotiated with the corpse. Again, putting a little more of the onus on the applicant to forward over these potential benchmarks. Then there is a final release of credits, which is the remaining credits in the corpse side. They're released after the final performance metrics are met. But under the corpse plan, the interagency review team can recommend an adjustment. And again, it can be in either direction. So though there is flexibility, credits at the end of it, it might fall back on the other direction. That's a consideration to take into account. Whereas in the SMC plan, you get the final 30 released upon the full certification of the bank. In other words, meeting all of the benchmarks in the design and the site development instrument.
So if I could, let me ask a question just for clarity. It sounds like what you've said. First of all, I like your statement that that release of credits is performance based. That helps me a lot. It's the performance of the growth of the vegetation that releases credits, so that's great. But I think what you just said is that at the very end, certainly from the Corps' perspective, the number of credits that you have applied for way up front that you estimated based on your site plan would be saleable may be changed based on the performance of the wetland itself, right? It could be either increased or decreased based on the performance of the wetland. Is that correct?
That's correct under the Corps plan. So at the end of it all, if they go in and do a site inspection, they'll determine whether or not the pre-planned credits to be released will be released, or if there is an adjustment that should be made on either side due to whatever developments have occurred in the process. The SMC plan doesn't have that same caveat at the end of the final release of credits.
As I had read this earlier and I listened to it again, my impression is that the SMC approach allows a lot more front-end load of receiving credits prior to any performance of the property. It looks to me, as I read this, I'm through the third release and I'm still in plan as opposed to any performance. Looking at the core plan, for example, I don't get the second release until after 2 consecutive growing seasons. If I look at this, it appears that I get through the third release with SMC when I'm still in the planning and paper phase. Am I reading this correctly, Juan?
So I do want to clarify that in the second and third release, they are performance-based metrics under both plans. So the second release of credits in the SMC plan says that they're released after the demonstration of wetland hydrology and planning. That demonstration is a performance metric. In other words,
all right.
Evaluate as to how that's progressing in terms of the hydrology.
Okay.
Yeah. And the same thing for the third release of credits. That's again on the completion of the approved planting plan.
Thank you very much. That clarifies that. It looked pretty stilted otherwise.
Yeah, it would be leaning much more one way than the other way. But thank you for your question. I'm sure that was a good clarifying point. I will also add that under the SMC plan, the second and third release of credits, though they are performance-based metrics, they do allow for what's called incremental certification. Incremental certification is in the event that you are, say, 60% towards meeting that wetland hydrology benchmark. They will take that into consideration and release 60% of the additional 20% of credits because you've made that progress. That similar incremental certification is not found under the Corps plan. So the SMC provides a little more flexibility on how the wetland is developing while still allowing a release of credits. So then we're going to go ahead and move on to how you establish those credits and how you end up with however many credits you end up having under the planning phase. The general standard under both plans is pretty straightforward in that a unit of wetland credit is awarded for each acre of wetland created. So 1 acre of wetland created is 1 unit of wetland credit. Under the SMC plan, like I just said, you get full credit for an acre of wetland, but given the type of ecological system that a wetland is, you will not only have wetland acres, but you'll also have wetland edges and buffer requirements to meet. Under the SMC plan, those acres are credited at 75% of the acreage created, which is different under the Corps plan. The Corps plan does give full credit when you create a new wetland acre, so long as the establishment results in a gain in aquatic resource area and function, when you're creating a wetland, that's pretty standard because you're creating something out of nothing. That's again geared a little more towards those that are rehabilitating previous wetlands. But it is a consideration just when you talk to your wetlands expert to say, this is a net consideration we have to do under the Corps plan, and they'll better advise you on that front. But the credits for wetland edges and buffer requirements under the Corps plan are much less than those under the SMC plan. In other words, you'll get more credits for wetland edges and buffer requirements under the SMC plan than you will under the Corps plan, because those are credited at 10 to 25% per acre compared to the 75% per acre in the SMC plan. The Corps plan also has an additional cap on those credits that can be awarded for wetland areas of 15% of the total credits of the entire project. So that's another consideration to stack on top of the fact that they credit it a little bit less than the SMC plan, or a substantial amount less than the SMC plan. Another consideration under these acres of wetland is the requirements of buffers under both plans. The buffer requirement of the Corps plan is pretty straightforward. It requires a buffer of 100 feet regardless of the size of the wetland surface area. The SMC requires a bit of differentiation in the buffers, but even on the largest escalation of the wetland total area size, you with a 50-foot buffer, which is half required for that than under the Corps plan, which will inherently provide more wetland area than wetland edge and buffer requirement areas.
So I'm just, by the way, any task force members that don't have the two regulatory schemes, I think I've emailed them out to everyone, I think, but if you'd like them, just let me know and I'll send them out. Buffer is a defined term, and without going through the definitions here, is there any significant difference in the definitions, or is it what you'd expect?
It's pretty what you expect on both sides. The biggest difference in the buffer definition is just what is considered a buffer area. So under the Corps plan, it's not considered a buffer area if it's below 100 feet, but that is really the only distinguishing factor between the two plans in terms of that defined term.
Okay, but the word buffer, but interpreted by the Corps and SMC, is not materially different.
No, it is not materially different.
Okay.
So then once the amount of credits have been established under the plan, you have a certification of credits, and the certification of credits again differs under either plan. So under the SMC, it's certifiable by the reviewing agency. So the SMC, per the credit schedule that we looked at a bit earlier, it'll certify those in the first, second, and third releases according to those performance metrics or other metrics that may be negotiated between you and the SMC if you're drafting that banking instrument. They are certifiable at any point, but no later than 5 years from the date of planting. Again, this is negotiable, but it's a typical timeline for wetlands as far as I've come to understand it. And after the second full growing season following the creation, in other words, following the construction of the wetlands, the SMC can conditionally certify credits based on the schedule again. And those incremental certifications that we talked about earlier have a small further requirement of the 75% of minimum number of native species present. And then in the ecology of the wetland, and it also requires that the native species fulfill a 15% total dominance test, which is a scientific test best known by wetland experts, but it is a metric they include there for the conditional certification. On the Corp side, the credit is released and is authorized in a letter format and sent to the property owner prior to the sale of the bank of credits. They're released per the credit schedule. Again, the Corp is a lot more flexible in terms of and ambiguous at the same time in terms of what the metrics are. So that's also negotiable. They do not have, as mentioned earlier, any conditional certification. They're either certified or uncertified credits.
And I was going to ask you a question, but I found the answer in your document. I was going to ask the question of why do you certify? And then I found the question very, very clear. Certification allows for a reduction of posted financial security. So if your wetland is certified, it means that I believe the regulatory agency is confident that the wetland will take and will grow, and therefore reduces the financial security that the bank owner has posted to guarantee that the wetland will actually take. I believe that's right.
That's correct.
Okay.
Perfect. So we're going ahead and move on to the sale of credits. So under the sale of credit, For both plans, the sponsor has a couple responsibilities. The first responsibility is that they naturally need to keep a ledger of the available credits, both purchased and unpurchased. And they provide the reviewing agency, SMC under one side, and the district corps and IRT on the other side, with the updated ledger at the conclusion of each credit sale. And these are reporting requirements. Some of the reporting requirements will cover other reporting requirements a little later. A little further into the SMC plan, the certified conditional credits can be sold if adequate funds are established through financial surety from the seller. And then uncertified credits can be sold for mitigation purposes only. And again, if the adequate funds are established through financial surety. The SMC also has the sole authority to determine the number of credits available for sale. They'll keep track of that via the reports that you provide them, and all sales of credits do require that prior SMC approval. Both plans have penalties available in the event that more credits are sold than have been approved, and they'll end up being either a reduction of the total credits available for sale at the end of the program, and some get as severe as the cancellation of the bank. That's something to keep in mind, but approval is required under both plans prior to any sale. And then another consideration the SMC looks at is, while determining whether or not to permit the sale of credit, so they look at the initial physical and biological improvements at the bank site were completed no later than the end of the third full growing season. That of course doesn't apply to the first release of credits that happen after the bank instrument has been signed, but they do apply for the following performance metrics if that covers in that particular timeline. The Corps is a similar provision. But under the Corps plan, the Corps, consulting with the interagency review team, they release credits per the schedule. They also can conduct a field visit prior to a requested credit release. Again, no credits can be sold without their authorization. And if the credit purchase agreement between the sponsor and whoever is purchasing those credits or attempting to falls through, the sponsor must provide the district, so the Chicago district, with written notice within 15 days. And this initial physical and biological improvement provision, it has a smaller timeline. In other words, the site must be completed no later than the end of the first full growing season in comparison to the SMC's end of the third full growing season. So it allows a little less time to achieve what needs to be achieved prior to the sale of credits.
Great.
All right. And we're going to go ahead. If there are no questions on that front, we can also answer them later. But we're going to be covering the performance standards required for the full certification. In other words, that last round of credit releases, what needs to be achieved under each plan to get those credited and available for sale. Again, this happens at the end of the project when all the benchmarks have been met. The SMC requires specific guidelines for the species composition in the wetlands, the species dominance, and the hydrology of the wetlands. The Corps, again, is more ambiguous and a little more vague and requires a lot more onus on the applicant to lose those benchmarks and have them be approved. So there's no initial guidance on the particular downs. The SMC plan, as you'll see, there have several different requirements for the species composition. A lot of them include native species and their proliferance in that area and per each acreage of the wetland. And then species dominance also is a big factor they look at. Essentially, again, native species should be the more prominent of everything, with the limitations set on non-native species. And then the hydrology standard is demonstrated with each wetland for which credit is sought from data that the SMC already approved to be taken by what's called a piezometer, and I might be mispronouncing that, but it's essentially a hydrology monitoring device. And they are placed throughout the wetlands to be able to report that information back to the reviewing agency.
All right.
Great, carry on. You're doing a great job. Thanks, Mom.
So we're going to go back. So we covered the credit releases and what it takes to certify and establish them. Now, under each plan, they each have certain considerations when evaluating a bank prospectus or whether or not they're going to follow and approve a potential bank. Some of the initial requirements and considerations are shared between the two. In other words, the bank can be publicly or privately owned. They can be incorporated as a for-profit or a non-for-profit. All the lands in the project that are proposed and accepted are to be protected in perpetuity from any future development. That is something that is included within the deed in the banking industry, instrument, which is the legally binding document. So even if the interest is transferred or conveyed at a later time, that would be in accordance still with that restriction, that perpetual restriction on prohibiting future development. Additionally, under both plans, bank sponsors manage the bank and they design it to be self-sufficient in an ecological sense, with adequate financial resources. And like I mentioned a little bit ago, the ownership interest can be transferred or sold so long as it has prior approval from the interagency review team or the SMC, and so long as the person or entity receiving the ownership interest agrees to the restriction on the land for future development.
Okay, let's pause there for a second because I have a question that I've asked, I think at every meeting so far. Can the owner of the bank that is established, if you can transfer it or sell it, can you use it as collateral for a loan? So in a specific situation, if a certain park district would be establishing wetlands and would want to advance the receipt of cash prior to the release of credits by the regulatory agency, could that park district go to a lender and use the established wetland as collateral for a loan?
Is a good question, and unfortunately it's not addressed in either ordinance, that nuance. Because it is an ownership interest, I would have to say that it just depends on whether or not the lender is meeting the guidelines. I have a better idea to that particular nuance.
Okay, thank you.
Can you repeat that? It got garbled for me. Can you repeat the last couple of sentences that you?
Sure. Because the ownership interest can be transferred, there are stipulations to that transfer, including the agreement that if you end up possessing it, you can't do anything with it in future developments. But those aside, that particular nuance just isn't addressed in the ordinance per se, and is one that's better informed by experience. So if Nancy, you have any experience with that, that would be great.
I have not heard of anyone doing that, but it doesn't sound like there are any statutory restrictions or regulatory restrictions, and it would really be up to a bank to decide on a case-by-case basis.
That's very helpful, thank you.
And it would be up to the bank to make that decision, you say?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, because the ownership interest in that particular exchange might end up being transferred depending on whatever happens in the future, it does still require the prior approval of the reviewing agency under both plans. So it's not solely up to the bank or the lender to decide whether or not to take that on, but whether or not they decide to take that on and the reviewing agency agrees to that procedure.
Yeah, and that depends on whoever you transfer it to. For example, if you decided to transfer ownership to someone who clearly, in the view of the agencies, was not capable of handling the management going forward, then the transfer wouldn't be approved. For example, an entity that wasn't properly capitalized, didn't have any experience at all in terms of dealing with wetlands, et cetera. But once that approval is granted and the transfer is actually happening, then it's up to the bank.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on.
Wonderful. So just finishing off the considerations and establishment on this slide, under the SMC approach, it does also, if you're going to incorporate it, it does require it to be incorporated in Illinois. The corps didn't have any such sentence requiring that, but it again does allow for incorporation. And another difference is obviously the permit requirements are different. One is a Department of Army permit under the corps plan, and one is a normal permit processing, a normal local permit processing procedure under the SMC plan. Wonderful. And then so when approving an area and when approving a particular site under either plan, both plans have shared objectives in what they consider and will reject a proposition based on, and then both plans also have some differences. So jumping right into the similarities in the two plans is that the proposed land would be rejected as a potential site unless it is owned or fully controlled by the sponsor. It contains a majority of drained or hydrologically modified hydric soils, which of course would require someone to come validate that prior to the application. That it has no high quality aquatic resources that would be damaged by the proposed plan. Obviously that it contains adequate perimeter buffer lands. I put the asterisk there because the buffer lands, as we talked about before, have different requirements under both plans. Just wanted to remind everybody of that. And then make sure it contains no hazardous waste, and that should also be confirmed by a qualified person or entity. And they will, according to each plan, will reject a proposed land if any one of these are not met, but it doesn't mean they'll necessarily be rejected if any one of these are not met.
So I'm sorry for interrupting again, but if these 5 conditions are met, does that preclude the regulatory agency from rejecting the site?
No, there is no obligation on the reviewing agency to accept any prospectus or plan. That is purely a discretionary decision, even if you meet all of the requirements that they have put in the ordinances. At the very end of the day, it's discretionary. As you'll see in the next slides, where I explain a bit of the differences that they also consider when evaluating a proposed plan, there's room for ambiguity in that either the Corps or the SMC approach will allow for the reviewing agency to incorporate different factors to balance and see if the plan is an appropriate one, and they'll approve it. But we'll dive that into it a little bit on the next slide, and we can come back to your question if it hasn't been answered at that point.
Okay, well, let's look at the next couple of slides then.
Perfect. So again, just for the site selection criteria, it differs between both the SMC and the Corps approach in terms of the minimum size they normally look for. So the minimum size under the SMC approach is that they require at least 10 acres to be proposed, or 5 acres if it's within the Lake Michigan watershed area. In comparison, the Corps approach requires 20 acres, but they do allow for smaller if it's approved by the interagency review team and it's within the Lake Michigan watershed area. These are all case-by-case analyses, so any one factor in one case will not necessarily apply to another or to your prospectus. Under the SMC approach, it's also a requirement that the land be part of an adopted or accepted open space plan, a watershed plan, or any of the plans listed there. Additionally, there's a similar requirement under the Corps approach with a little bit different language, so I thought it was worth distinguishing them. But this one, instead of being part of, it requires it to be compatible with the adjacent land uses and watershed plans, which again are things that are negotiated and talked about with the reviewing agencies as they approve or don't approve the plans and the application. The Corps plan does also explicitly require things that are maybe a little more on a national scale, essentially like cannot adversely affect protected, endangered, or threatened wildlife or habitats. And they also include that the use for natural water storage functions of wetlands, it's a requirement. It cannot be the primary use, but it also is a use of it. Additionally, they again reiterate the buffer requirement, which they really harp on. I don't believe there's much flexibility on that, if at all. But they do keep reinstating it in every section. So just something to keep in mind in terms of managing acreage use. And here's where I was talking about where the Corps approach has extra considerations, which essentially incorporates any and all factors that the interagency review team considers relevant. There's a list in the PDF that they've included in the ordinance, but it is an open list. I included some examples here, like development trends, relative locations of impact and mitigation sites. But those are, it could include any factor in its decision, which makes meeting every factor and arguing that you must approve the application a difficult argument. The Corps approach also has things that are highly recommended It's unclear the weight these carry. However, they are included as a separate subsection of the things they recommend. So I presume they carry at least substantial weight in their decision-making process. So they recommended the proposed land is identified as important wetlands under the Corps in the US EPA advanced identification process. This one in particular is geared more towards rehabilitation than it is to creation, as there won't be a wetland prior to creation. But this again shifts the focus of the Corps more towards rehabilitation and what they're really looking for in approving these plans. It also said that it must provide habitats for at-risk species. Plans that include that or have a higher chance of success, according to them. That the land is identified in the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory. If it promotes and provides important breeding grounds for both migratory and domestic wildlife, and if it contains a high native plant species diversity, either to begin with or in the plan after all. So I'll take a pause there and see if your question was answered, and if not, and if so, we'll just go ahead and continue.
Yeah, I'm fine. Bonus points. Bonus points? You want bonus points?
No, I'm just how much weight does the Corps typically give to these extra considerations?
They went to the trouble of including that they're highly recommended. So I would say they would at least give it some material weight. However, they don't include the percentage that they would consider it in comparison to the factors they consider that are more or less required. There's no real guidance on that in either ordinance. And again, they could state any reason as to why one factor might matter more in this circumstance than say perhaps 2 years from now.
Yeah. Nancy, have you seen other applications where this has been important?
I think it has been important, but again, as Juan said, it is not one of the primary factors. But if you can go in and say, for example, I'm just going to pick one out, that it provides habitats for at-risk species. And this is why, particularly in, say, this particular area in Lake Bluff, say the species numbers are declining. And you're making a demonstration that because of the type of plants and hydric soils you have, this is a particularly attractive place for that species that's on the decline. And then the Corps, I think, would certainly give it more weight.
Okay.
Thanks, Nancy. So we're going to go into the differences in the initial planning stages. If everyone remembers at the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation, I know it's been a minute, but it requires an initial site inspection and requires an initial prospectus to be introduced under both plans prior to the full application being approved. And this is going to cover those as well as financial assurances. So in terms of first steps, the SMC requires a little bit less than the Corps plan does under the SMC. Is that required informal discussion we talked about earlier. And they'll include in that discussion anything that they think might help you in your bank application, any extra legal considerations they feel are something you should be aware of, as well as some guidance as to your particular wetland proposal. In other words, the SMC could in fact tell you to put in some of the things that's required under the Corps plan, but that's not inherently in the ordinance. So under the Corps plan, again, it only recommends that meeting and visit, and probably because it only recommends the meeting or visit, it has a more defined expectation for what should be included alongside the initial request and prospectus. Those requests must be accompanied by, I think it's roughly about 10 bullet points, maps, different testing, and wetland expert would have a better idea on what exactly would be best for the wetland and best for the application process, but it does require these factors in your initial application.
So it looks like I'm being flippant here, but it looks like the SMC first steps are a cup of coffee with the regulator, and the Corps first steps is a 75-page document with a lot of experts that need to be hired, right?
Well, yes, and to be clear, when the SMC approach proceeds on to the next step, in other words, when you're actually submitting that initial application, these are some of the topics that will be included in that application, and they'll give you the guidance on what particular things might be helpful, and you'll also have the guidance from the wetland expert on what should be included in there to help that application, but it is not necessarily going to be, there will still be paperwork submitted on both plans. It does appear the course plan is a little heavier at the outset.
Okay.
It is.
Kind of like the other stipulations on that SMC had on the plant materials and whatnot.
Yeah.
And the course, as well as kind of what we agreed to, but something tells me that what we agreed to is probably pretty comparable across the board.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on.
So in terms of what should be submitted in that initial planning stage and initial application, there's the prospectus we've been talking about. And this prospectus will not only serve as the initial information point for agencies as well as public comment, but it will also serve as a basis for the future legally binding instrument, whatever banking instrument that ends up becoming under either plan. So again, those similarities that you should provide enough information in that prospectus to support informed public comment and allow for them to include their general considerations. And when I say their, I mean the reviewing agency, for them to be able to apply it to their evaluation criteria. It should include, and they both give these lists of enumerated objects that the prospectus should include. Naturally, that's alongside the request that the corp's already included. But those are listed for you there, and as well as in the PDF document. And then there are differences as well, more differences into what should be included in the prospectus. So the SMC requires an outline of the management and maintenance responsibilities that the sponsor expects to have and plans to have, and essentially promises to have. And the construction plan, the schedule of completion, including planting, administrative, management, monitoring, all the works. And then the event you choose to incorporate it, that charter of incorporation should also be included in that initial application. Under the corpse plan, they're a little bit more specific. I think essentially it covers basically the same things when you take the construction plan, the schedule of completion into consideration, but the corpse does require these specific delineated aspects to be included in the prospectus. So it'll be essentially how you structure the prospectus to meet either plan, but discussion on how the proposed bank will be established, the strategy for the goals and objectives, and the feasibility of the bank, again, requiring a wetland expert to kind of give you that analysis. The discussion of the ecological suitability, how the site supports wetland functions, assurance of hydrology, the means for establishing hydrology. And there is an important aspect of the corpse plan that isn't under the SMC plan that I think will play a larger role here than perhaps in other plans, particularly that they also require discussion of the qualifications and experiences of the proposed bank sponsors. In other words, past activities related to wetland creation or rehabilitation that have been undergone or completed projects. That's not something that was mentioned in the SMC ordinance, but it is something that was mentioned in the corpse ordinance that I'm assuming they will give some weight to in the application process. And that's just on the application on the prospective side. As we mentioned earlier, there are financial assurances that we need to end up within these stages. The financial assurances under both plans require a description of the assurances that you plan to have, and then a high-level discussion on how those funds will be divvied up and used to achieve goals. The bank sponsor shoulders the responsibility for securing those funds for the operational life of the bank and for the long-term management of the bank. We'll get into that distinction a little bit later, but it's pretty straightforward in that the operational life of the bank is covered by the banking instrument, and then after that, it becomes long-term management. Additionally, you need to propose a release schedule of financial assurances. So in the same way that they are releasing credits based on certain performance metrics, you will propose a release schedule of financial assurances based on each task that needs to be completed. So establishing hydrology or planting X species. But again, the wetland expert will give you a better delineation of what exactly needs to be included in that assessment. The SMC and the corpse both have funding requirements. You'll see in the PDF that the funding requirements for the corpse are slightly more demanding in that they require a few extra requirements and approval stages from the interagency review team, including that they need to, for example, have written approval of the particular assurance from all parties. And then the forms of assurances are also listed under the SMC plan. And those again are mirrored in the corpse plan. The corpse plan also has a specific line included in there that there are two sets of assurances technically. One set of assurance is a project construction assurance, which essentially falls under that proposed release schedule of financial assurances that will be broken down by task. And then they'll have a different set of assurances regarding the ecological success milestones. So whether after the task has been completed, if the task is fruitioned to X point, that has been determined in the banking instrument that's been approved by the courts. But those would be separate and non-intermingled funds and assurances. So that's something to keep in mind, that it will require that extra administrative step.
So I think we're going to have a couple of questions here.
Sure.
And this is not really, well, maybe it is partly a regulatory question. It's much more a practical question. And so I guess I'll address this to Nancy. We're in the current situation, we're talking about a public entity, a park district that was created by the voters by referendum. It's a taxing body, all the things that we know that park districts are. It is not for profit, obviously, but it's not a separate corporation. It's organized for the public good. Part of the public good is creating recreational activities. In the application, Nancy, of these regulations, either SMC or the Corps, in the application of the regulations, is there any consideration given to the public nature of the bank sponsor, whether it's a township, a park district, a city? Is that part of the discussion?
In my experience, a governmental unit would be regarded as a pretty stable sponsor. In terms of them getting down into your public purpose and those sorts of things, in my experience, I haven't seen that. Generally, what they focus on is the issue of whether you have the ability, and Juan mentioned this earlier, as one of the criteria, the capability, the experience to manage this. And obviously, the Park District has management experience, but what both SMC and the Corps will look to is, again, your consultants. That's why I made the maybe overstated point earlier of really drilling down on the consultants and making sure that, you know, the consultants and their subconsultants and their contractors and their subcontractors are all a team that will really work together to demonstrate to whichever agency you wind up going to in the end here, that you've got a solid team in place with spectacular expertise who will be able to manage this, you know, basically put it together and then manage it on your behalf.
Okay. I have another broad question, very specific to this situation. And this is a very unique opportunity for the Park District to provide, so let me back up. So the Stormwater Management Commission of the County of Lake has approached the Park District asking the Park District to consider stormwater storage, additional stormwater storage to be located on Park District property. In exchange for the Park District agreeing to have stormwater storage on the Park District property, the Stormwater Management Commission has offered to pay for the development of, if that is a solution desired, for the development of a wetland on the property. So if you follow me, if this actually comes to fruition, the Stormwater Management Commission and not the owner of the property will be responsible for completion. So my question is, how does that change these financial assurances?
Interesting situation. It might be a situation, and again, I'm purely speculating here, because this is a situation where I haven't dealt I mean, I've done a number of projects for park districts, but not something where you've got the two potentially co-applicants here. And I think, again, it would make sense to talk to first your consultants and then ultimately the agencies in terms of how they would deal with it. If I were just playing devil's advocate here, if I were a member of the Stormwater Management Commission, I might require the park district to be the applicant and demonstrate to me in a side agreement that, and by side I don't mean non-public, but a public agreement, that the park district was going to manage it in a manner that would serve the particular purposes, again, outlined in that agreement, to manage it to the benefit of the Stormwater Management Task Force, or Commission, rather.
Yeah, I would see that as part of the interagency agreement, that at the end of the day, the park district is the final owner and probably quite likely would be the final party to sign off on performance. As to what you're kind of getting to for funding, while it's not wholly as much as this one, I think the example we saw in DuPage County, they were funding significant portions of that golf course rehabilitation and wetland development with federal and state grants. So as opposed to not, this is a situation where it would virtually be 100% funded, but nevertheless, in those situations, even if it was funded by 40 or 50 or 60%, I'm not sure that the difference is that significant. You've still got other parties who are governmental units who are responsible for providing the outside funding for that.
Mm-hmm. Right, I agree in that in DuPage was approved. And so, yeah, I think it's totally doable just as it was there.
I think it's just a question of how you construct
the arrangement,
the agreement.
Well, yeah, well, in this case, go ahead.
No.
Yeah, I was going to say in this case, then you've got the interagency agreement. And if the Stormwater Management Commission is legally obligated in that document to fund, then I wouldn't see that there's a significant likelihood of either SMC or the Corps to be concerned about that because they've got the legal obligation in front of them.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Do we have other questions on finances from the task force? Okay, let's move on. I think long-term management on financial assurances are next.
Correct. So in terms of long-term management, so after the operational life of the bank as established in the banking instrument, the sponsor must establish an assurance to ensure the bank site can be maintained in perpetuity. And the plan must demonstrate the bank and wetlands will be maintained either by ownership or conveyance of interest. Again, it seems there's particular nuances given the SMC's proposal that will be ironed out in whichever plan you undergo that particular difference. But under each plan, they require a bit of a different thing in terms of long-term management. The SMC allows for interest on escrow accounts to be used towards this management, but it can only be used for the monitoring, the management, and the maintenance purposes of the bank. In other words, you can't take the interest on escrow account and add it to a different portion of this plan. And then sureties must be financial sureties, that is, must be maintained until there is either full certification, in other words, all the benchmarks are met under the banking instrument, or that all credits have been sold, which implicitly states that the metrics have been met because you wouldn't get all the credits credited until you've gotten full certification, or the SMC determines that the bank is self-sustaining on an ecological level, and that's a determination they make completely discretionary. Again, this required surety amount for the establishment of maintenance in perpetuity is reviewed annually. In other words, they can lessen the amount required of financial assurances depending on the progress of the bank per year. Under the corpse plan, the plan does need a strategy for the establishment of a fully funded endowment for a long-term management activities of the bank. Again, it sounds like that's something the SMC will, and you guys will figure out under the banking instrument regarding funding specifically towards that. So I won't harp on that for too long. Additionally, under the corpse plan, the long-term bank manager must provide the written approval to the Chicago district engineer of the acceptance of the long-term funding mechanism, whatever mechanism that ends up being. Again, and under the corpse plan, the district requires provisions to address inflation over time, and then you can also require other contingencies as it sees fit, which is a bit of an open-ended question, and there's not real further guidance in the ordinance to describe what those contingencies may be, but I'm assuming they completely change based on the context of when you're applying for it. Yeah, so on that point, we're gonna go ahead and move past financial assurances if there are no questions on that, and we're gonna move towards the different.
One quick one. I assume there's no guidance in the regulations as to the amount of the surety that's required. And if there isn't, Nancy, do you have any practical guidelines for us to think about? Is it a percentage of the value of the bank? Is it something else?
Generally, they look at, the other contingencies would be the performance over time of the wetlands. If it's wasn't managed well, that is a nice weasel phrase for them to say, hey, we need a little bit more financial assurance here because you folks need to do more things to improve. And then inflation, they would probably tie that to consumer price index.
So it's case specific.
Very much so.
Okay, thank you.
So what needs to be included in that legally binding agreement? Again, the SMC will work with the applicant to create that legally binding agreement, and the corpse only either approves or rejects whatever's been proposed by the applicant. But under both plans, they require slightly different things to be included. One similarity is that they both must include provisions for long-term financing, and again, the protection of that land from future development. To be included in the deed or a similarly legally binding aspect of the plan. The SMC at this point in the legally binding agreement requires a site development plan that will be approved by the SMC, as in they're forming it with you. And it'll identify that bullet pointed list, essentially focusing a lot on the ecological plans, species-wise, hydrology-wise of the bank instrument, of the bank included in the banking instrument. And then the court, under the corpse plan, the interagency review team approves the banking instrument. Again, they don't help you create it. They only reject it. And they might give you some guidance, but it's not included in the ordinance that they have to, or that they would necessarily will. And then the Department of Army authorizes the permit. So there's just different organizations here working together to keep in mind. This banking instrument includes the description of the proposed area and all of those other things that are included under that. Some of these mirror things that were included in the initial application process and not at this stage yet, but because this legally binding agreement is based on that prospectus, which includes those other requirements, those will all be pulled in whether or not they mirror these. Are there any questions there?
Those are very different approaches, aren't they?
Yeah, they do look different right at the outset. I mean, one obviously leans more towards the ecological side of it all, and then one leans more towards the planning and management of the ecological side. But again, that's why I mentioned that in the corpse plan, they kind of did the heavy lift on the ecological development side of it at the beginning, where they required to make sure the habitats weren't being affected and all these other ecological considerations at an earlier stage in the process. So this would be after that prospectus has been filed, after the public comment period, then the legally binding agreement is drafted, which is why they're including these, and again, pulling in the stuff from the prospectus, which the legally binding agreement must be based on.
Seems like the core accelerates the ecological discussion to the front of the application process. And then once they know what you're going to plant, then they monitor the planting, and SMC is more concerned about the structure of the arrangement and then gets into the fulfillment with the ecological performance of the bank. Seems like it. I think we get the same result, just a different, but it's interesting. Okay, we're close to finish. Let's keep going.
We are close to finishing. So the next section is about the sponsors, monitoring, management, and reporting responsibilities. Again, with monitoring operational life of the bank in the long-term management sections. For monitoring under both plans, qualified persons need to make periodic inspections of the soil erosion control measures. Those are monthly reports that need to be made and distributed to the agencies. The SMC only requires you to distribute to the SMC directly. The Corps requires you to distribute monitoring reports to each member of the interagency review team. They don't really provide a procedure for that, but I'm sure they include something in their conversations that they might have with you regarding how to send in those reports after approval. Under the SMC plan, the monitoring period extends 5 years from the date of the completion of the planting plan. So you have another 5 years to monitor, issue those reports, and get them over so they can see how the bank is progressing and to see if it is at full certification level yet. Then other monitoring results provided on an annual basis to the SMC until the end of that 5-year post-planting plan period. Other monitoring results, of course, include hydrology, vegetation, the variety that they'll require, and that's all negotiated with the particular entity and what reporting they would like from this particular bank or a different bank. They also reserve the right for a site inspection at any time. The Corps plan, the Corps plan also allowed it earlier at any time, so this isn't necessarily a distinguishing factor, but they do include it under this monitoring section, and the Corps does not. But they also have a little bit more specific regarding finances. So the amount of financial assurance to be reviewed is going to be reviewed annually based on the results of those required monitoring reports. So Nancy touched a little bit on that earlier. Depending on how your year went in those monitoring reports, they might up or lower the financial assurances that they need from the sponsor to feel confident that the bank is progressing as it should. They also have yearly bank audits on the bank. And their monitoring reports, again, like I mentioned earlier, provided to all members of the interagency review team annually until the performance standards are met and all credit sales are completed. So it doesn't have that same monitoring period distinction. It's a different end metric based on performance standards and credit sales. And then the interagency review team conducts joint field inspections to confirm the data on the monitoring reports. It didn't specifically say whether or not they could do it at any point, but likely they'll do it after the submission of a monitoring report they'd like to confirm the information on, but it doesn't mean they'll do it every time you submit a monitoring report. Yeah, so in terms of monitoring report, that's the end of the responsibilities there as listed in the ordinance. So this is the operational life of the bank that I mentioned earlier. The operational life of the bank under both plans consists of the period during which the terms and conditions of the legally binding instrument under either plan are in effect. These obviously don't include the provisions for long-term management and for perpetuity provision. The operational life of the bank terminates when the mitigation credits are exhausted and that they've all been released and then sold. The banking activity is either voluntarily terminated with written notice to the reviewing agency, or the SMC or the District of Chicago, depending on which plan, finds the bank to be functionally mature or self-sustaining on an ecological sense. But that's also identified in each legal binding instrument. After the end of the operational life of the bank, then the long-term management and responsibilities kick in. The long-term management section in the Corps includes some things that weren't mentioned earlier, but in the SMC, just because they're not in this image doesn't mean they don't have any long-term management situations. We talked about some of those earlier, and those are just pulled in again, but these extra considerations are added to the Corps plan. In other words, any proposed long-term manager should have expertise in executing adaptive management procedures. This would speak a little bit to your question regarding whether or not they might approve a bank as a lender in the event you want to have that credited. They'll take this into consideration. So they also must have provisions to transfer long-term management responsibilities to a land stewardship entity. And that is whether or not you plan to do that, but you do need provisions of that in that legally binding instrument. And then lastly, the sponsor needs to provide a confirmation of the financial assurances, a written verification of the site control, and a confirmation that's submitted February 15th of every year. And again, not a consideration under the SMC plan. They rely more on the monitoring reports and the annual financial assessments. This is similar to the annual financial assessments with a little bit more information required. And then we have the modifications, non-compliance, and termination. Those are pretty briefly summarized in the PDF. For those of you that don't have the PDF, modifications under both plans need pre-approval from the reviewing agency. In the event of non-compliance, so in the event you are under the SMC plan and you are non-compliant with legally binding instrument, then they will approach you and figure out a period for you to remain in compliance or get into compliance with legally binding instrument, and they'll reevaluate after that period is completed. And the difference in the corpse plan is that if you are in non-compliance with the instrument, the sponsor has the responsibility to approach the corpse and with a proposed plan on how they plan to get back into compliance, and then the corpse can either approve or reject that plan and propose a different plan to achieve that compliance. And then in terms of termination, the corpse plan does have a termination procedure, requires written notice, and the SMC plan said they required written notice in another section, but they don't have a particular section towards termination, but both can be terminated by written notice to the reviewing agency. And if anybody has any questions that are still remaining, please feel free.
I'm impressed. Wow, yeah, thank you. I'm impressed. This is great. Do we have questions?
I have one, and I'm not sure, it may be outside of the purview of your review, but because of the different regulatory authorities, one county and one federal, and because of the different requirements, is there a difference in the saleability of the credits?
So the difference in the saleability of the credits in terms of those agencies particularly is that they're subject to those agencies' approvals. It's the only thing in the ordinance that really identifies a difference between how the credits can be sold or not sold. But those are things that are also negotiable under both plans. They don't have necessarily written in mandatory, this is how the sales will go. But those conditional, full certifications, uncertified credits, all of that will be considered by the agencies. And like you mentioned, the corpse plan does have different agencies to be taken into consideration. So administratively, that could be a larger headache than under the SMC plan, which is more of a practical consideration, but I'm sure Nancy might have some other ones to add.
Yeah, I mean, you do have the IRT team, which is, three agencies on the federal side. So there is more bureaucracy involved, no doubt about it. But all of the consultants in this area, I mean, they're very familiar with both approaches. And I think that, at least in my experience, the credit value really isn't different. But in terms of the real value here comes from the arguments that you can make for the value of those credits as you're developing and then using the credit, or basically producing the credits in the bank over time. So again, going back to my hitting you over the head once more in terms of just the importance of the management folks, the experts that you have on your team.
Okay, but is there a difference in the area in which the credits can be sold? For example, if the credits are only SMC credits, can they only be sold to parties that need offsets in Lake County? Or while the perhaps Army Corps credits could be used in a wider area, perhaps outside of Lake County?
It's possible, actually. It could be possible in both instances. Although the huge preference, especially within the jurisdiction of a local agency, will be to use those credits there. So yeah, that's something to take into consideration. And quite frankly, agency policies have changed, a little bit over time. They'll vary depending on what's available in terms of whether it's a buyer seller's market for credits at a particular time, agencies may be more lenient in terms of expanding the area, but generally the closer the more likely if the credit sale is to be approved.
But there's no statutory limitation that would prevent somebody in McHenry County from taking our credits here in East Lake County.
Well, what the statute does require is that, well, first of all, you've got the credit ratio. Obviously, they have to buy more credits than they're taking away in value. But in terms of the comparability issue, for example, you want credits from the same type of wetland that supports the same soils and species to the extent that you possibly can, where the credits are being used from the bank that you're taking them from. So again, there's a lot of discretion that is accorded to both the agencies. In my experience, the local agencies may scrutinize it a little bit more, but again, that's, in my experience, and other people may have different experiences and broader experiences that necessarily the day-to-day experts will.
Yeah, I think this is an issue, the question that Mr. Treffs is asking is a very important question, because it's my understanding and recollection that when the executive director of the Stormwater Management Commission gave us a presentation back in January, that he indicated to us that if we went the SMC bank route as opposed to the core, that our customer base was going to be limited, and I wrote it down, only to those that impact isolated wetlands in Lake County. So not even all wetlands, but isolated wetlands in Lake County, because those are the type of wetlands that the county has jurisdiction over. Whereas if we went the core route, our customer base would literally be the entire Illinois River watershed. So anything that doesn't drain into Lake Michigan in the Chicago district. And I've got those notes, but that's an incredibly important issue for us, because despite all of these details, and I hope that Steve is not going to ask us to pass an exam at the end of the meeting tonight.
Ready to hand it out.
Financially, the more important issue is how quickly we think we can sell the credits and at what value we can sell the credits, and whether we have to spend $200,000 on expert assistance to go through one process or another, if there's a couple $100,000 more to go to the core process. But if we can sell $7 million worth of credits 3 years faster going through the core process, then that could swing the entire decision-making process. So I don't know if what I'm saying makes any sense to you, but I have definite notes to that effect, that our market base is much, much larger if we have a core approved bank.
It does make a lot of sense, because the regional banks, the regional authorities can restrict significantly. Now, not all of them necessarily do, but if that is what you've been told locally in Lake County, then that's the threshold question really for your marketability. And marketability obviously is what this is about, in terms of being able to generate money from those credits and providing more services and options to the residents. So that would be the first question I would take to your experts and or SMC if you're considering them.
Yeah, that sounds right. It sounds like SMC has made a decision that the banks that they're responsible for have a marketplace that is much narrower than they otherwise could have decided. We need to validate that, but that sounds right based on what we've heard from everybody. and that the core has a much broader definition. My understanding is, and we need to talk with them too, but my understanding is that wherever the Chicago district core operates is potential marketplace for us. We'll again need to validate all of that, but I think that's a critical point to Al and George, that there is a difference in the marketability of credits that are created based on the regulatory scheme. Has nothing to do with the regulations, it just has to do with who they are. That's great. Any other questions, task force member, staff? If not, I will now pass out the exam. Multiple choice. So thank you, Julie, and thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Juan. This was to me, a fascinating hour and a half. Learned a lot, got a lot of notes. Go ahead.
While we have Nancy, was there anything else you wanted to share? You shared a lot of your experience and insights along the way, so perhaps you've exhausted anything, but I did want to give you the floor for a minute if you think there's anything else that we should know or be thinking about, or issues you've encountered.
I think I've, as I mentioned before, pretty much hit everybody over the head in terms of the expert team. But up here at the end, in terms of the marketability, that again is really just a huge, huge question. The other thing I will say from doing work for park districts and other municipalities and localities is, and Lord knows I don't need to tell you folks this, but really public perception is so important in any of these projects. So community involvement, like you've been doing, having these open meetings where anybody from the public can come in during the investigatory process. I mean, I just think that's fantastic. If some of our other clients had done that, our lives would have been a lot easier and probably their legal bills a lot smaller, because things would have been resolved more easily in terms of getting to a solution for a particular legal issue. And here, I just see you folks doing everything so diligently and thoroughly with public participation that you're well on your way. And if you need us for just general advice, please reach out to us, and we'll be here to do whatever we can.
Just wrote that down.
Remember, Julie said it's all pro bono.
And Juan, I want to have a special thanks to you. One of the things I've done since I was in high school, I've tried to learn a new word every day. I do crossword puzzles, I read a lot, and I write down a word that I learned. And today's word is piezometer, which I've never heard of before. So thank you, Juan, for I can go home, worry about anything. I've got it done. Any other questions for our speakers?
Just a comment that PowerPoint was absolutely excellent.
Yeah.
I hope
Yes.
just a
Thank you.
wonderful summary.
Yeah, I will say geometric.
You guys did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Hold
much.
on.
One more.
Raised hand.
Hand up, okay. John, I thought it'd be you.
Yeah, well, first off, it's Juan, thank you for introducing that term, but it's piezometer is the
Yes.
pronunciation. And that is it's a shallow well that has a recorder on it that records the elevation of your groundwater compared to your surface. So that's what those are. Secondly, the questions were very astute about the area for which you can sell credits in the SMC bank versus a core bank. In the SMC bank, your service area is the Chicago River Basin within the county of Lake. The core service area is everything within the Chicago district, which is, I believe, 6 counties, that doesn't drain to Lake Michigan, a considerably sizable area. So yes, as Juan very astutely pointed out, it is much more difficult permitting process. It is a slower credit release going through the core, but the object of the game in mitigation banking is to sell credits. And with the size of a bank that you could produce, having to incorporate that much flood storage as the SMC needs, it would be a very long time, if ever, to sell those credits through an SMC bank because of the limited service area versus a core mitigation bank where you have a much, much larger surface area to contend with. Thank you.
John, just to clarify, you did say, so it's not even all of Lake County with the SMC Bank, it's only the north branch of the Chicago River. So the Fox and Des Plaines watershed and Lake Michigan watershed are all excluded. Correct? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
Oh,
And thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Okay, that was great. I mean, I've learned so much in the last couple of days about mitigation banking and the regulatory framework, and it was really fascinating presentation. I'm sure we'll come back to it as we go into our workshops coming up. Let's turn to agenda item 3B, which is an update of the Lake Bluff Golf Club financials. We had a draft version of this presentation 2 weeks ago. They're based on some questions, observations, and some refiguring based on the audit input, the Park District audit input. There are a couple of slides that have changed a little bit, and I'm going to ask Rob to take us through that presentation. Do you want this projected? And if so, how can we do that?
Well, I don't have control of it, so, and I've just got it on the PDF in the packet that was sent out this morning. I guess I can refer to page numbers.
Let's do that. That's fine.
Okay, well, for the most part, the report is intact. I mean, the draft has been removed, as you've seen in the packet. The areas of change or modifications that were made was like page 43. If you go to page 43, that is the rounds of golf.
Hey, some of us don't have page numbers, so you can say the page and then the title of that slide.
Page numbers.
What's the page number for the picture that says Lake Bluff Golf Club?
37.
37.
No, you can just count that out.
Yeah.
Okay, I went off the page number off the PDF file that I have.
Okay. So what page?
You can see a Jeff can put it up at the.
Okay.
It look like this.
Oh, that one, except that one.
I'm not
On
sure.
April 4th, yeah.
It's right after bar grass.
So Rob, are you looking at the page that says Lake Bluff Golf operating budget?
No, when you scroll through the PowerPoint, you go to the timeline, then you have the US rounds of golf, then Lake Bluff rounds of golf played from 2007 to 2021.
Okay.
And then the slide right after that is the one under Lake Bluff Golf Club annual rounds. That is a new slide in the packet that we didn't have before. Has everybody found that?
Yes.
Okay. And, you know, I might actually kind of defer to Steve on this too, because he was diving into these numbers, trying to make sense of it, because I can tell you the big challenge here was that the Park District managed the golf course up until Billy Casper. Then they took over the management of the golf operations. We still did the maintenance on the course. And then Golf Visions came in and did everything. And they gathered information differently than the way we used to gather it. So, Steve, I take my hat off to you for diving into these numbers to try to make some sense of it.
Well, I mean,
a lot of variables.
Yeah, let me give you a few. We want to go back to the main report though and identify what has been changed from the draft. But let me go to this page since we're talking about it. So one of the, so back up here. So the last time people looked at utilization of the golf course, they received two numbers. One is the percentage of residents of the park district that use the golf course, unique residents, some of whom I understand golf 200 times a year on the course itself, but unique residents. And then the second number was the percentage of the rounds played, rounds defined as either 18 holes or 9 holes, but the number of rounds played by residents. So the two numbers that were talked about in 2019 using 2018 data, roughly 8% of Park District residents utilize the golf course. Those 8% generated 19.5% of the rounds played in 2018, either 18 or 17. And those numbers were pretty consistent over the preceding decade. Okay.
And Steve, how,
yeah,
if I may, then how were those numbers collected in those 10 years from 2008 to 2018?
I was just going there. So okay. We didn't know. So we actually talked with the prior executive director, and asked, how did you get those? And it was a manual process. He had staff every year go through the names of people who played golf and determined whether they were residents or non-residents based on address or zip code. A very manually intensive process.
So we all came to the golf course to play around, and I haven't played in a long time yet. We did give our name?
I don't know. I don't know how, I didn't look at the source data of the old numbers, but that's what he said. It was calculated manually. The rounds were calculated based on differential in revenue because residents, right? So residents pay a different amount than non-residents. And for the prior, when the Park District was managing the golf course, they took records of everyone, they said, who played golf, or most of the people who played golf, and got fairly comfortable with resident, non-resident based on the revenue that they received. So fast forward to today.
Would you have a question?
Yeah.
Would resident in that respect, the historical perspective, be meaning a resident of the Park District?
Yeah, resident of the Park District, as we said in our first meeting, the Greater Lake Bluff community.
As opposed to somebody who's paying resident fee, like somebody from Lake Forest. So it's.
Right, because the definition today is different.
I don't know that.
It's on the website.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know that. I just know that the 8% number was a manual accounting based on a process that was established by the people who manage the golf course, i.e. the district administrative staff, you guys.
Driven by the individual names, if you will, rather than fees.
And then the rounds played for those people were based on the resident, non-resident calculation.
Okay.
So let's go forward to today.
And so that was what period of time again from?
That was prior to, that was 2018 and prior.
Correct.
Like
prior to Kemper.
Yeah, prior to Kemper. Okay. So now we have a situation where there's the first attempt at outsourcing a portion of the operations of the golf course, which happened in 2016, 2017, and 2018. I would call that a partial outsource of some of the operations to a management firm, but still lots of financial responsibility and cost on the part of the Park District. It was an attempt to mitigate some of the losses that were being incurred in prior years. So 2016, 2017, and 2018, the resident numbers were captured as well as the rounds were captured. So they were still fairly consistent, 8% of residents, 20% of rounds played. We get to Gulf Visions, and Gulf Visions 2019, 2020, and 2021 did not and has not and doesn't have the capability of calculating the number of residents who utilize the golf course. They just don't have the data. I've asked every way I can think. They don't have the data. So unfortunately, and I'm sorry everyone who was looking for this number, we don't have a parallel for 2019 and forward to the 8%. So let's go with what we have. Let's go with numbers we have, and that's the number of rounds. And that's what this page is, looking at 2019, 2020, and 2021. Gulf Visions has very specific records. Each year is about 5 pages worth of very tiny print that shows the number of rounds by category, and I have summarized them here. This is Gulf Visions looked at these, and we have come to an agreement that these are numbers that we are comfortable with. So go to the bottom. 2019, there were 18,000 rounds. 2020, the COVID year, there were 20,890. In 2021, there were 30,294. 26, what did I say?
20.
Oh, 26. You know, I just can't, I can't, yeah, I need help. Thank you. That's what friends are for. I need help.
Let me ask you this,
Yeah.
the total number of rounds, was that similar in the pre-Gulf Vision days?
The number of rounds, 2019 was a relatively low round, but there was a chart. I don't have a chart. Yeah, it's not in this slide, it's in the prior report.
Page right before this chart, detailed
Okay.
chart.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
There you go.
So you can see the decrease and then, but the gradual shifting that occurred. And then you can also see the 2019, 2020, and 21 numbers as, you know, they reflect.
Okay.
Okay? So the good news is that at point of sale, so if one of us would go up and want to play around a golf and not have a reservation, or not have made the reservation online and want to play around a golf, they will gather information at the point of sale, resident or non-resident. You can quibble about whether they ask everybody who's in the group, if they're resident or non-resident. You can quibble about all that, but they do capture it. They charge different rates. And these are real and true numbers for that portion of the golfing population. So 30% in 2019, 43% in 2020, 36% in 2021 are what I call allocated between resident and non-resident. And for all 3 of those years, it looks like roughly 90% or more of the rounds that are allocated are resident. If you look at it as a percent of total rounds, we go from 26% in 2019 to 41% in 2020 to 33% in 2021. Everybody okay with that so far? Okay. Unfortunately, that only accounts for 30 to 40%. Let's say a third if we look at 2021 numbers. So the rest of the rounds played on the golf course, there are not allocations between members and non-members. They don't capture, for example, when somebody reserves a tee time online. There are 2, Golf Now is an online system where people can reserve. It's kind of like Open Table, right? You can reserve tee times at various courses in the area. The Lake Bluff Park District has its own, but there is not a resident, non-resident determination made when those reservations are made and when people play golf. That's about another third, 30% or so of all of the rounds played. The last 4 categories account for another third or so. Those are season passes or memberships, leagues, high school or college teams, and then, you know, the catch-all of the passes, the complimentary, and then the miscellaneous rounds of golf. So if you think of rounds of golf, we've got them in three groups. We've got allocated, we've got pay online, and we've got all the rest. And I can't go from these numbers into a total percent of rounds played by residents based on the data that's available. We can make some assumptions, right? I can probably suggest that high school, college is probably more non-resident than resident. I could suggest that season passes are probably more resident than non-resident, but I have no idea what numbers to use, neither does Golfish.
Well, with the case of season passes, I did have a red line under that. When you get a season pass, don't you actually fill out a form with your name and address?
Yeah, but I think you can have season passes as non-residents
Yes.
too, right? Yeah. And they don't capture that. They just capture the money.
And there's one other thing too. If you look at the membership requirements right now on the website, for the golf course.
Yeah.
It defines a Lake Bluff resident is defined as residing in Lake Bluff, Lake Forest, Libertyville, or within the park district boundaries. So the resident number is not a pure resident number of the Lake Bluff Park District boundaries.
It's not as specific as what we collected in years.
What we believe we collected.
What we believe we collected.
Correct.
Manual though it was and everything else like that.
Right.
So that
So,
makes
so
the
even
question-
the 26, 41, 33% on the top row, even that number is a jump ball in terms of what it really means.
Yeah, it's simply the record that they're capturing that they say are residents versus non-residents.
Right.
It's nobody's happy. I'm not happy with this. Nobody's going to be happy with this. But it's what we have. And we've said all along that we're going to talk about what facts we can uncover. And this is what we can uncover. And I don't think we can get much more deeper.
And on the flip side, one would ask the question, why would there be a sudden shift in that allocation in between 2018 and 2019? But in terms of resident and non-resident. I could see perhaps with COVID, I guess all bets are off in 2020. But in 2019, I guess I'd have to say, why would that be significantly different in terms of utilization? At the same, with the same degree of uncertainty that we're describing for resident categories for years 19 through 21.
Yeah, so if you go to the graphic on rounds of golf play, the one we talked about before, and you look at 2019, that's really an outlier low. And it's when I asked the question, the answer was that was a horrible season for golf, that it was really wet. The golf course was swamped a lot, and it was really hard to play, not just here, but all over, and people didn't come out to play.
Yeah, heavy rains that year. Actually, the 17th fairway was submerged so long it killed all the grass. It was a really horrific rain year. Yep.
So that's what we have. And if anybody wants to go through the 3 pages to find, I have a file here. If anybody would like to do it, I'm happy to share it.
Well, hats off to you, Steve, for even diving into it, because I wouldn't have known how to really tackle anything in that database. So thank you for taking that stab at it.
Let's go through the rest of the golf course, because I know this is exactly what Todd Porter, when we started the meeting, had questions about. So we'll get back to Todd and others, but let's finish the golf course discussion. Rob, if you would, by going to the pages that have had some modifications.
Okay, well, if you proceed to the next slide, we have the public golf course information surrounding courses. Nothing's changed there. The next slide is the golf course operating budget from 2015 to 21. This is where we had the auditor come in and help tweak some of these numbers to get them, as accurate as possible. So there was some fine tuning that was done on this slide for 25 to 21. And for the next slide, which is 22, and then projecting forward with more information from the executive director on some of the projections they were setting for the golf course. So it's really just minor changes in here, nothing of any drastic difference. The next slide shows the debt service for the golf course, which retires in 2026. There was a new slide added after that, which is showing the debt for the whole park district in its totality. And it shows that the golf course is 8% of the total debt of the park district. You can see the majority of it is really the community center, which was built in 2001. So, but I think it's important to see that big picture of, the golf course is a small portion of the total debt of the district. Any questions on any of that new information?
Yeah, Rob, I thought we were gonna add a line in like slide 45 and 46. Go down 2 steps further to then subtract CapEx from the net gain and loss and come up with a then net cash outflow to the park district.
Well, I can't really speak to that. John was doing a lot of the editing here, and he's not here tonight, so I can't speak to that question very well. I apologize.
So let's maybe you and Rob can get on a call with John.
Yep. Okay.
So I think why you didn't do it on this particular slide, you're questioning is because the title is operating budget. They would have to change the title to operating and capital, and then, but yeah, the very bottom line is what it's of most interest to.
Right.
I agree. The majority of people.
So, but as you can see, the debt's rolling off in 26. You can see that 8% of the total debt will then be retired on the total park district itself. And then the final slide that was modified was under the capital, a clarification of capital needs, which we have to scroll down, past operating budget summary. The golf needs, capital needs are outlined here in a narrative form, but it's the following slide is the new one showing the capital golf list from 2018 to 29, and then what it is today moving forward, because the clubhouse work has been completed, a good portion of it, I should say. And this is a summary page that John put together, and then what's following it is a little more of a detailed breakdown. But that's how the new golf capital list, a budget of 807,000 was created from the original of 2.7. But most of this work has already been completed with the rehabilitation of the clubhouse. And that's the new information in the packet.
When was the 22 to 31 budget? When was that enacted, direct?
The board constructed that capital list in the recent months. I can't say specifically when, but that's something that came from the current board approval.
Gotcha.
When that was.
Oh, Noah, was that through the budget process in November or October? November?
So it's very recent.
Okay, yeah. And I
Yeah,
think that-
Typically, budgeting is all done in the fall. So this probably originated somewhere during that time period, fall of 21. But
Gotcha.
at least historically, that's when budgeting is done.
So the reason for that for that page, golf course capital needs, there were questions 2 weeks ago as to how the last time these numbers were shared with a broad audience, the capital needs were 2.7, 2.8. And there was a question, how'd you get from 2.7 to 800,000? So this was an attempt to show the difference between those 2 points in time.
Yeah. And to go to committee member Trump's question, I think what you're looking for is this master capital list to be included on that operating slide. So that way, for example, 2022 projected to spend $67,000 plus is not shown on that one slide. I mean, that's what you want, right? Right. So you want to follow up with executive director dealer and have them modify the Excel spreadsheet and redo that.
Let's just do one sheet. So let me just back up and kind of summarize a bit. I look at these financials and I think there's 3 takeaways here. And this is partly addressing some of the questions that we had from our presenter, our visitor, our one visitor. I look at the findings of this analysis as 3 things. One, from a pure operating perspective, that is from the operating expenses and the operating income to the park district. That means not looking at long-term debt, not looking at CapEx, capital improvements. Just from an operations perspective, what this report shows is that the deficits that were occurring in the past, that the park board identified as non-sustainable, have been alleviated by the hiring of electricians. So outsourcing, and I would, as opposed to Billy Casper, which was a partial outsource, this was a full outsource, that has stemmed the tide of red ink on an operating basis, an annual operating basis, so that from a P&L perspective, the golf course is pretty much a non-event on an annual basis. That's number one. Number two, there's $625,000 worth of long-term debt that's attributable to prior improvements made to the golf course, the driving range, the clubhouse, and some others. That debt remains. It's going to be paid off $125,000 a year for 5 years and then reverts to 0. But if the golf course would close tomorrow, that debt would still remain and have to be paid off. So it is very real. Somebody better feed that dog. It's real, but that's the second piece. And then the third piece is a real liability for the golf course, for the golf district. It's the long-term capital expenses identified as $807,000 over a 10-year period, I think.
That's
And that is, I view this as the cost of having a golf course under the arrangements that are in existence with golf districts, right? So from an operating perspective, the golf course is now a non-event. From a long-term capital, we understand the liability that has to be paid off and when it ends. And then there's the long-term capital expenses that are the cost of maintaining a golf course that people want to use. If you have a golf course, you can't let it deteriorate, you need to maintain it. We also heard 2 weeks ago that Gulf Visions and the Park District are preliminarily talking about potential modifications and extension of their contract, which I don't want to get into, but this capital expense is a subject of those conversations. So that's how I don't look at, and maybe I'm looking at this too simplistically. I look at this as 3 numbers, not 1. Understanding that you have to look at them in totality every year to get the financial impact. But I really look at them as a stable budget, a debt that we have to pay off, and capital that if there is a golf course, you want to maintain it up to local standards. So that's kind of how I look at it. So I'll stop and see if we have comments. First of all, to task force members, any questions or comments on the golf presentation, both pieces?
I just, and I know we've all said it before, it's very, very important because it was already, I think, a misunderstanding. One of the upfront call-in comments at the beginning of the meeting, the debt service is there, whether the golf course goes away tomorrow or we keep it for the next 10 or 20 years. And any chart of summary numbers should very clearly call that fact out, that we've got to pay, the Park District has to pay this remaining $700,000 regardless of the decision, because that's very important to understand. I mean, that's a big swing in the numbers.
Yep.
I know.
You gotta pay the credit card.
I know that, and I don't know how much you want us to drill down on numbers, but I know Member Collins, or not Member Collins, Mickey Collins, a resident, had asked specifically about the maintenance of the clubhouse. And where does the normal maintenance of the clubhouse building, is that now under Golf Visions? Where is the year-to-year just normal wear and tear of a building? Fix if the roof leaks, is that ours? Or if the HVAC unit breaks down, because there's $0 in capital for the next 10 years, where is that? I know we indicated we were gonna look at that a little further. I don't know if you had a chance to do that. I know you're swamped.
I can answer some of that. So a lot of the day-to-day maintenance does fall on all Visions to do, let's say, for instance, the HVAC.
Can you talk into the mic? Sorry.
I have one in front of me.
Oh, okay, thank you.
If there's a repair to the HVAC unit, and they need to call out whomever to do it, that falls on them to make the repairs. But it caps out at a certain point based on the contract we have. I don't have that figure in front of me right now, but it's up to a certain point they pay for repairs, and after a certain point we are responsible for capital repairs.
And so where in the operating budget are any anticipated costs? Are we figuring that nothing's going to break down that's large for the next 10 years?
No, it's actually shown in should pull the right slide. 46 on the paper, which is like operating budget. We account for that as part of the expense as far as commodities are concerned.
Commodities?
Yeah, there's a 7,500, 7,000, 22,000. So some of these smaller items that we do account for that may come up as part of repairs.
Okay, so clubhouse, so any miscellaneous larger clubhouse items that's above the contract with Golf Visions would
Those
come
are
out
some
of
of the
that.
items that we have anticipated as well, that will probably come up.
And then the line about personnel services, and I know that the Golf Visions operates the club, but there's not one member of the Park District staff who's even a portion of their salary is allocated to the golf course at all?
No.
And you don't work on the golf course at all? No, and your guys?
We don't allocate for any work that needs to be done.
Yeah, you don't allocate for it in the budget, but do you
So are
actually?
you asking, like, say, for instance, if we had taken down a tree on the golf course to get Park District property, do we account for that as part of the capital? No.
Okay, but so it's more or less your personnel, Park District personnel services for the golf course are truly limited to that type of emergency situation where a tree falls. We don't do any, Golf Visions they do all the landscaping and everything up front with the entrance and the flowers.
Yes, correct. They are fully responsible for all ground stuff. So.
That was the difference between Billy Casper Golf and Golf Visions.
And now Golf Visions has complete responsibility in their contract for furnishing the carts, however, and caring for the carts for now until the next contract.
Correct.
But that's all part of their agreement right now. Boy, that's a huge swing. Yeah, that's good news.
Yeah, that, pretty much so.
Yeah. And then what was the thought process 4 years ago? And I don't know if you were involved 4 or 5 years ago. there was a huge swing in the maintenance building capital. It went from 220 some thousand to 75,000. I know Rob was around then, so maybe he could chime in as to what were we, and are we talking about just the two little buildings at the end of Washington, or are we talking about the bigger, including the bigger building that's back behind the school?
I think it's, that was related to the building behind the school where all the golf maintenance equipment's located. What's down at the municipal services is the park district equipment as far as park maintenance. But I think there's, as I recall, that building was going to be needing a new roof. There was some work that had to be done with the chemical building, which houses all the chemicals for the golf course, but has to be contained unto itself. But boy, I'm scratching my memory here a little bit. I'm just looking at this, the capital needs, what's in here. They've got the cart barn roof in 2025. They anticipate having to repair. Gosh. Honestly, I can't really tell you. My memory doesn't serve me well enough.
Okay, and I think you commented before the cart pass, there was a $225,000 swing in the projection for the next 10 years. And that's just based on an up-to-date analysis, and Golf Visions was comfortable with us not resurfacing. I haven't been out there in so long, I can't remember the difference between the paved paths and the stone paths. And is the plan now maybe to have some of them go to a Merrimack stone or something?
Well, I think they had thoughts early on with the first budget to do a lot of new asphalt paths out on the golf course, which are not being done now. And I don't know, maybe they're considering going to more of a crushed gravel, which might be a little more environmentally friendly. But I don't have the detail on these two different capital needs from 18 to 29 and the new one from 22 to 31.
Noah, do you have anything on the path specifically?
The paths? Yeah. So the original budget number came from an analysis from GCG that was talked about in the past as far as what could potentially need to be replaced in the next 20 years. So that's where we get the base number from, but much like a lot of different things, it's analyzed on a frequent basis. Does this need to be done? Does it not need to be done? If there's no need to replace it, then it's not done. We also talked with Golf Visions. They did not feel that a lot of their cart path work needed to be done just yet. A lot of their cart paths are still in great shape, so there's no particular reason to replace if it's already fine. That's why the number, we still wanted to account for some, just in case work does need to be done, but that's why the full number is not in that long-term budget right now, that we don't need to spend.
Okay. All right, and then the other thing that I might suggest, if this all ends up being part of our informational report, is the people that, a lot of people will look at this that haven't paid attention to the golf course before, and they're going to ask why was there a $1.3 million swing in the clubhouse? And I know I understand some of it because several $100,000 has gone into the building, improving it in the last 3 years. And the idea of putting an elevator, which I think was $750,000, went away. But I would suggest that because there's such a huge number swing, that maybe that this golf course capital needs, that maybe we have a list of notes like we do for the annual rounds played, that might help clarify some of the huge differences. Just as a suggestion, I don't know how everybody feels about that, because be a lot of finger pointing, it's gonna be.
I think we can elaborate that. So the whole idea here was, You know, we have a 2.7 number, we have an $807,000 number. And there are differences. Some of the 2.7 was done, was accomplished, was paid for, and I think we need to identify that.
Right.
Yeah, I
So
think what we paid from 2018 to 2021 would be a good number to have.
So we need a column in the middle of that, right? So,
Right.
okay, so.
Or maybe two,
Maybe,
one already paid and then revised estimates or
Yeah.
revisions or
Yeah.
some kind of,
or deferred or something.
Or
Yeah.
at least annotate.
Jimmy,
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Great suggestion.
Yeah.
Suggestion.
okay.
And then while I was talking, I'll finish up real quick.
Take as long as you need.
On the notes for the annual rounds table,
Yep.
a couple of the notes did confuse me also. Number 3, Golf Visions does not provide data on the percentage of Park District residents who use the golf course.
Correct.
And, but yet our table, did have some split for the on day of sale. So I
No, that's percentage of rounds, not percentage of residents. So the data in the table is rounds based, and we don't have data on the residents. So if you take that one resident who played 225 rounds of golf in 2021, they would be counted 225 times in the 10,089 total. But but we don't have them counted as one in the residents.
So
3 and 4.
I know you can only have so many notes, and then the number 4, Golf Visions does not provide data on the
Does
number.
provide.
Provide data on the number of rounds played. Okay. All right.
I'm happy to,
Misread.
if anybody wants to wordsmith this or add some more, the more the better. If there are any questions, let's answer them. Yeah. Anything else from task force members on this report before we go to, I see Todd is in the queue.
weren't we gonna have a slide on 9-hole golf courses in the area?
We can put a slide in there. I've done some research on identifying. I've identified 5 local, I should have put that in actually, identified 5 local golf courses. All I have really is the 5 that I chose. I chose them because we have the area as well as the length of the 9-hole course. Yeah, that's easy to put in. And I should have done that. Good catch. And 9-hole golf courses, by the way, they vary greatly in size. You can have a 9-hole, a 9-hole very short golf course, or you can have a regulation 9-hole, and the size range can be, 30% of a regular one. But I'll show you. I'll have that next one. I've got it.
Okay.
Any other comments?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm confused with that 9-hole.
Yeah. So one of the questions was, it relates to the slide that shows surrounding public golf courses, about the first one in. So we have Lake Bluff, Deer Path, Fox Court, Shepherd's Court, and we show the number of yards and the acres.
Mm-hmm.
We had some people asking for a couple of 9-hole courses that did the same thing. And that's easy enough to figure out.
According to someone I know fairly well, who's a golf course developer, a 9-hole course is something on the order of less than 50% of an 18-hole golf course. There are some fixed pieces of the golf course that you end up having regardless, but an easy rule of thumb is to assume 50%.
Yeah.
So
you get 18-hole, 9-hole.
look at Lake Bluff, and for 149 acres, that's roughly 75-ish. A par 3 9-hole can be done in about 25 acres.
It'll take too long to find it, but I found some 9-hole golf courses that are like 120 acres.
Mm-hmm.
They're huge 9-hole golf courses. Usually those are ones that are integrated with their features, woods or wetlands or ponds or everything. So there's a lot of variability, but people have asked for it, we'll throw a couple.
What is the purpose? I'm confused still.
Part of it is to understand the size ratio. So how big is an 18-hole golf course? How big is a 9-hole golf course? So we have some basic facts that we can deal with.
And only because Emily, I think someone did just ask, hey, have you considered a 9-hole course? So that's just to have the data on how much land would have to be left for a
And
9-hole
maybe
course.
is that to explore whether there's a possibility of retaining the 9-hole course and someone's.
It's certainly one of the ways that could be.
One of the things the code group says they're looking at.
I'm sorry, we missed that.
Hello, are you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Okay, go ahead, Ted.
So I do want to address the resident, non-resident issue because that data is seriously flawed. But first, I want to discuss the fiscal condition, and you're highlighting 3 important numbers, Steve. And I think those are the right numbers. But I think an important point to make about those numbers is the first number, that is the golf course's operating situation, is very certain in that we are going to get a very small percentage of the revenue of the golf course and not pay any expenses. And so that number is very projectable. And similarly, the fixed payments on the debt are predictable and factual.
Yep.
But this idea that 10 years of capital expenditure, we can calculate down to $800,071 is borderline, fallacy. That's, and the uncertainty around that number is illustrated by the fact that the number has changed dramatically in a couple of years. And it's extremely possible that the number changes back. A lot of happen to a capital intensive business over a 10-year period. The irrigation system could break, and that's $2 million. And so you need to at least highlight the fact that these capital expenditure numbers are highly uncertain and, not definitive in any sense of the word, at least relative to the other numbers you're throwing out there. And, related to the resident, non-resident question,
Todd, hang on a second. So I agree that the future capital expenses are projections, as well they should be. They're projections that have been produced by Gulf Visions, and they're included in the Park District financial projections. But I absolutely agree, they are projections that are subject to the realities of life. If a hurricane comes and dumps 40 inches of water on the golf course, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that's going to have to be fixed. So
if it's a wetlands. If it's a wetland, it'll be fine.
We'll all be able to go swimming on the golf course. Yeah, so I think a footnote is fine. And I agree with you totally that the annual expense and the debt service are fixed numbers. Some people could make an argument that if golf becomes more attractive and people begin playing golf more, that the Park District is actually giving up revenue because of the contract that they have. But they're the numbers that we're dealing with. I agree with you, and I think on the CapEx side, having a note to that effect that they are projections is fine.
And I think uncertain projections is a more accurate characterization, and maybe manipulated expectations. But back to the resident, non-resident issue, I think, I appreciate, you're trying to get to that number. The most striking to me about why these numbers look suspicious is if you compare 2019 to 2020 in the resident rounds allocated, there's a dramatic increase, 140% more rounds by Lake Bluff residents, while the Lake Forest residents and the Libertyville residents also golf more during COVID, but for some reason they only golf.
I don't know that, Todd. I don't know where you're getting a number. If you have one, can you share it with us? I don't have any information about what's happening in Lake Forest or in Liberty.
Well, I'm talking about the non-resident golfers in Lake Bluff.
Okay.
Who are likely from Lake Forest and Libertyville. Those golfers, the non-resident golfers in your analysis from 2019 to 2020 only increased their rounds 18%, right?
Unless, I don't want to be argumentative, Ted, but unless they paid online, and then we don't know whether they're residents or non-residents. That's part of the challenge here is that.
Well, let's put it this way. The only category that dramatically increases, and it increases by 140% from 2020 to 2019 is the resident rounds at Lake Bluff Golf Course. All the other rounds go up, but not nearly that magnitude. And so it's very unlikely statistically that looking at such large samples of people, one group of people will decide to golf 140% more. The people would only golf 18% more. And
yeah, I agree.
That's extremely implausible.
On the face of it, you scratch your head, and then you think, that was COVID. Golf was one of the.
Why would COVID differentially impact Lake 10 times the rate it?
Yeah, I don't know, other than perhaps since it was one of the few things that we could do to socialize and get out with friends and not have to worry about it. I don't, that might be it. That just might be a COVID effect. It might be something else. I just don't know.
I don't think you're grasping my point. It can't be just a COVID thing because nationally the COVID rate went up about 8%. On residents using all golf course increased about 18%. It is extremely unlikely that 6,000 played in Lake Bluff, 140% more. That's almost all the increase is in Lake Bluff resident golfing, and it's just not plausible. And the reason it's also not plausible is we know that the incentive structure for collecting this data is to bias it toward residents. That is, the people who come in say they're a resident to say they're $3, and Golf Visions is not going to doesn't want to put up any obstacles to somebody coming and giving $200 of pure profit, right? If somebody shows up and says, I want to play with my foursome at Lake Bluff Golf Course, that's $200 to.
We lost you.
I'm not going to say, oh, let me see your ID because I don't believe you're a resident. They're just going to say, sure, come on in and golf and come back next week. And they're not.
We hear you. We hear you. These are the numbers.
This data is not factual, Steve. It's estimates, and you should not purport it to be factual. And if you can't get factual data, it is not correct to simply say this is the best we can do. And present the data. The correct answer is we don't know.
Well, I said that. I said these are the best numbers that we have. They are tied to the Golf Vision financials. So I can tell you.
No, it's not 33.3%. That suggests you know, and that you have some high level of precision in your knowledge, and that is false. You should put something like maybe 20 to 30%.
Okay. I mean, these are in the Golf Vision financials. So all of these foot back to a number that is in their financial reports. I presume that's been looked at some point by the Golf District. But Todd, I don't like this any more than you do. I wish we had really solid and firm numbers, but this is all we've got.
Don't claim you don't report the numbers if you don't have good numbers. That's, rule 1.
Okay.
I think you have to, you report the numbers, but I think we all respect the fact that there's an element of uncertainty here that we don't understand.
Yeah.
And this is who we brought to the dance. I mean, it is what it is.
There's also an element of definitions here that's inconsistent with prior reporting. So we don't have apples and oranges that we're talking about.
That's correct. The numbers, it is what it is. We gotta roll with this, one way or another.
So Al and Mark, can you, because since I think you're going to be talking about some other issues, can you just look at this and think about the heading and the footnote, and if there's a way that we can add, so that people who look at this relative to this conversation really understand what this is. Sure. Making it simple.
Sure.
Okay.
I think Todd makes a good point that about the uncertainty of these numbers, but if we were to omit them all together, I think we would not be being fully transparent. So I think, Steve, your suggestion of adding additional headings or footnotes to indicate and describe where the uncertainty comes from is probably the best solution.
That's well put. Well put.
Okay. Do we have other, yes, over here, if you would. Oh, right there, you can talk right under that one.
I remember earlier when Al had, Mr. Trust had mentioned the resident definition on the website was defined as the Libertyville, Lake Bluff, Lake Forest person. Do you know when that change happened? Because that might be part of the reason for the change in resident to non-resident. They might change the definition of resident during 20.
I know, it did not change in 2020, because we looked it up in the program guide. Remember that? No, we can find out, we can get you an answer within that year of those.
Thank you. Yeah. Other comments from the audience? Yes. Yeah.
One more, Andrew.
Yeah, hi. No, my name's Andrew Hinkle. I run a golf league at Lake Bluff, and I would just say to be on the opposite side of Todd's point. I mean, this is just a small example. We increased our rounds during 2020 by hundreds and hundreds of rounds because of COVID. And I think that's just a small example of the amount of increase of rounds for local players. And as far as I can remember back, I've been playing at Lake Bluff for over 25 years. They've always asked residency as being Lake Bluff, Lake Forest, and Libertyville. So just a comment. I think the increase of local players is if there's some question around it, but personally, we increased it hundreds and hundreds of rounds.
So Andrew, just to be clear, when you say we, you and your group, your golfing group?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Correct.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Do you have another question?
No, I'll save it for another time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for listening. Jeff, anyone else on the line?
No, that's everyone.
Okay, anything else on the golf numbers? So we have a couple of additions or changes still remaining to the main document, and Jim, you're going to run those to completion, right?
That's correct.
And then we have some clarifications to this first look at resident rounds that Al and Mark are going to try to clarify a little bit, and we'll bring this up again in 2 weeks. Okay. George, do you have anything on V3?
Unfortunately, a very small report. Steve and I did meet with a Zoom conference with Noah and Executive Director Beeler and two representatives from V3. V3, unfortunately, has requested some information from SMC and SMC's consultant, Hay, who prepared some of these preliminary drawings for the conversion of the golf course to a wetland. And B3 was hoping to get more data from SMC and or Hay, and they haven't received any. We don't know if the data does not exist or if it was just a busy couple of weeks for SMC. The B3 contract wasn't awarded that long ago. And then the other caveat to our meeting is that Steve and I pushed them to talk to us earlier than they wanted to talk to us. So they weren't far enough along. They were hoping to meet with us, so have an initial phone conversation a week later. So we certainly will be looping back with B3 because we're very interested. We've hired them to try and confirm, number one, can 40 acres of storage be constructed on the course and still have a full 18-hole golf course. And then to also look at how many maximum credits they think the land can be converted to if we were to give up a golf course entirely. And then various other iterations, but those were the two big questions. So we still want to get that information from a completely independent consultant to verify SMC's presentation to the press.
And they do know we're meeting in 2 weeks, and they have said they will have their report for us unless there's something else that comes up. Thanks, Bert. Task force member reports. Anybody want to stay and read longer? We have a report.
I'll add 30 seconds to this. We put this together and distributed it last week or last meeting. I certainly appreciate. I found this to be really helpful. I'd like to be able to make it more productive for all of us if that's appropriate. And so,
can you just describe it?
Yes, sorry. This is a spreadsheet that has the headings that Mr. Ryan offered last time, and has across the top those constituencies, individuals, groups, whether they be SMC, Park Board, a project manager, a consultant, a banker, and so forth, and what place or play they have to all of this, along with trying to plug in numbers on budgets and timelines. So it's kind of a future living document, perhaps. As I look at this with fresh eyes tonight, we included a header that said SMC, and were we to have one for the core, the question is, would it be any different? And I would like to take another look at that and see if there is any material difference between the two of them. If there isn't, then that'll probably just say SMC or core or regulatory or something like that. So.
Okay, that's a great document. And we will be using that as we move forward. Any other task force members who want to report?
Well, just one thought, Mike.
Yeah.
My life is so miserable like yours is, Steve, where you were looking at golf course receipts for 3 days. I went back and actually replayed some of our original meetings over the weekend. And it surprised me because I had forgotten it, but Kurt Wolfer, the executive director of SMC, did specifically say to us in his initial presentation that he thought it made more sense that if we pursued the wetland mitigation bank path, that we went with the core. But he did not, we let him carry on his way at that time, and we were just hearing all this information firsthand, and we never circled back with him. I think that would be very, very important to find out, from the executive director why he thinks we should go that route. And maybe as simple as we have to get core permits anyway, because the Skokie ditch is a regulated water in the United States. And they're going to be involved no matter, if we do this project, they're going to be involved.
I didn't know enough in January to catch that was important. Okay, good.
And then the other, I'm sorry, one other thought, and Steve, I mentioned this to you, it has occurred to me, and it's obvious to all of us that the village does own some land along 176 that borders the golf course immediately adjacent to where these wetland areas are being proposed to be created. And they also own land on the other side of the Skokie. And it seems to me that if the decision is to pursue conversion to a wetland, that there is an opportunity to have the village offer their bordering property as buffer area through a conservation easement agreement that could result in a net gain of 3 or 4 more credits, which could be $500,000. That could pay for a lot of heavy-duty consulting, and I think we need to, at some point, we need to mention that because it is an opportunity that should not be lost. I don't know when, you can analyze everything to death, and that's a completely different scenario.
I would suggest one step, and that's to ask Nancy if the entire wetland, including buffers, has to be under common ownership.
I think the slides say control.
Control,
So if
yeah.
there's an agreement between the
Yeah.
village and the park district. Anyway, just throwing that out as a
That's-
thought. 'Cause
That's great. And
It's
then
land use that,
The same thing would be with the railroads, although those would be harder to
They would
get
be
common
real
agreement
hard.
on anything, but that would be. Also, the Belfour wetland, by the way. I mean, that's a different ownership in all the areas on the west side.
Yep.
Good. Anything else for task force? I have one real quick thing. I just want to lay out the next 2 weeks for you. So this was our last, other than some cleanup issues, this was our last fact-finding meeting. We're going to go in 2 weeks from now into workshop sessions, task force operating as a workshop in public open meeting. Think of it as a whiteboard exercise and begin to answer the questions that the Park District Board has asked us to answer in the remit. So we have 7 questions that are on phase 1 of the remit, which is what about the SMC proposal? We have 10 questions with a lot of excess bullet points on what is wetland planning, wetland mitigation, how does that fit? So in 2 weeks, we're going to deal with the 7 questions related to the stormwater management proposal itself, not wetlands, but the proposal itself. So I've asked Nikki and she has agreed, and she's actually produced a draft of answers to those questions. So we don't start with a completely blank page. She and I are going to finalize that in the next couple of days and get it out to the task force. And my intent is to use that as the beginning point of an interactive discussion. So we're all in sync, or if we're not, we know where we're at on answering the questions for the permit. I will update the draft of the stormwater management proposal that I distributed 2 meetings ago, I think, or maybe it was on the last meeting, reflecting all the things that we've learned since then. So it's sort of the narrative that is part of the workshop, really is driving the workshop discussion, and then from that we'll build a deck and we'll build a report. 4 weeks from now, assuming we finish in 2 weeks, 4 weeks from now, we'll do the same thing with wetland credits, which is where your diagram, Mark, is going to be really helpful in thinking through all the steps. So that's kind of just to get you all excited about the next 2 meetings. Nikki, why don't we just take a pause on, there were a lot of facts today. Let's just take a pause on that. And unless you have something that you think is so important that we need to reiterate.
You're on mute. Sorry, I would like to pause because if this were the quiz that you promised us, I would fail.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nikki. Emily, anything from the board?
Our discussion about asking D3.
You could do that.
I'm unclear really
Okay.
about what to ask. No, but I did request to add it to the committee meeting, committee of whole meeting for discussion with the board about asking for finance that like to tackle that position of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so one of the things that became really clear when we talked to B3 is that they're not retained to do any financial analysis. They give us a sense of what credit values are, but not really to look at the true financial impact to the Park District. So we thought that it might be nice to add to, if we could, extend the contract a little bit so they could begin to look at financials since they have it on the ground and they now know the topography and everything else. So Emily's going to go to the committee of the whole and see if that is doable, and if it is, then we'll talk with you. Thanks. Anything else?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
You stated that you would be analyzing the data, but also mentioned that you would be contacting Kurt again. So
At
you're
some
kind of, yeah, so you're still going to be circling back to some of these experts.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, just clarifying that. I was a little
To the
confused with
degree,
that.
I mean, I think we know a lot. I think as George indicated, Al, and Mark, and everybody who spoke, we know a lot more than we did, right, 3 months ago. But we still have some areas that are questions, and now we have lots of people.
There will be questions that come up.
Yeah.
For sure.
Just
And
making
next-
sure.
And the next month, we don't have the sum total of all knowledge.
Okay, great. I just wanted to clarify that.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. But from a fact finding perspective, we've covered the general topics that I think we needed to cover. And now we need to find out if we need to dive deeper. One area that we have to dive into, and that's what these two guys are going to be working on, Al and Mark. So the big equation, there's one equation, right? And it's number of credits that can be sold times estimated value of the credits equal revenue potential for the park district. Every one of those numbers needs to be fully examined. How many credits? V3 is actually working on that. We've got a lot of other resources for how many credits. We now know we have to figure in the borders. We now know there might be stream credits. There's a whole nother regulatory scheme just on stream credits that we need to think about. So we got people thinking about that. These guys are going to be thinking about what's the value of the credit. How is that calculated? How variable is that? What's the market demand? Try to build a model that we can get comfortable around it. So it's X times Y equals dollar signs, and we need to be comfortable with every one of those. And that's what we'll be doing in the 4 weeks. It'll be fun. Thank you, everybody. We broke a record. Is it true that when you meet in person, you meet longer? I think it is, but we broke a record for the time frame. Thanks, everybody, for sticking in. Thank you, audience. I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So
Second. Nobody's opposed. We're adjourned. Thank you all.
thank you.
Julie, thank you, Julie. This was fantastic.